Thaddeus Crowell rode into Bram Halloway's yard like he owned every inch of it, which, in his own mind, he already did. He didn't dismount slow. He didn't tip his hat. He kicked his horse straight through the gate, let it trample the edge of the kitchen garden Maren had spent 3 weeks rebuilding from bare dirt, and he didn't look down once. Then he swung off the saddle, walked to the kitchen door, and shoved it open with the flat of his boot. Maren was standing at the stove. The pot she'd been tending since before sunrise, a full beef stew, enough to feed 14 men, sat steaming on the iron surface. Thaddeus looked at her. He looked at the pot. Then he picked it up with both hands and threw it into the yard. The stew hit the dirt in a wide, steaming arc. 14 men's lunch. Gone. He turned back to Maren and said, "Tell your boss I'll be back for what he owes me. And tell him to send someone worth talking to next time." Then he walked out. Maren didn't scream. She didn't cry. She picked up her ledger from the shelf beside the window, opened it to a clean page, and wrote down the time. If this kind of story moves you, if you believe a woman's worth has never once depended on what she looks like or where she came from, then subscribe to this channel right now and hit that like button. Drop your city and country in the comments so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. Because a woman like Maren deserves to be known, and her story is only just beginning. The sign had been crooked for so long that Bram Halloway had stopped seeing it. It leaned left off the post at the end of the long dirt road that led to his main gate, a weathered plank with hand-lettered black paint, the letters uneven, the wood split along one corner from 3 winters of hard freeze. Cook wanted room provided. He'd nailed it up himself the previous spring after his 3rd cook in 2 years quit without notice, and he'd told himself he'd straighten it once someone answered the ad. Nobody had. The ranchers' wives in the valley weren't interested in feeding 12 hungry cowboys 3 times a day for the wages Bram could offer. The younger women from town didn't want to live this far from neighbors. And the men he'd hired as cooks couldn't manage a kitchen for more than a season before deciding the work wasn't worth the isolation. So the sign stayed crooked, and Bram more or less forgot about it. He was out near the north fence on the morning Maren Whitlock walked up his road, and the first person who saw her was old Cutter Hayes, who handled the horses and had been working that ranch since before Bram inherited it from his father. Cutter was crossing the yard when he spotted a woman coming through the gate on foot, carrying a single cloth bundle over one shoulder. Stopped and stared. Women didn't usually walk up to cattle ranches alone. Women certainly didn't walk up to this one alone. She stopped when she saw him. "I'm here about the sign," she said. Cutter looked at her for a long moment, the dusty dress, the shoes that had seen considerably better days, the face that was tired but not defeated. She was a full-figured woman with dark auburn hair pinned back and gray eyes that were steady in a way that made him think of someone who had made a decision recently and wasn't going to unmake it. "Boss is up at the north line," Cutter said. "I'll fetch him." "Thank you," she said, and she stood exactly where she was. Didn't sit down, didn't fidget, just stood in the yard with her bundle and waited. Bram came back to the yard 15 minutes later with mud on his boots and a bad temper from a fence post that had rotted through at the base, which meant a full repair job before nightfall. He was not in the mood for anything that required patience. Then he saw the woman standing in the middle of his yard, upright and still as a fence post herself, and his bad temper knocked itself sideways into something closer to attention. He slowed his horse to a walk and came up alongside her. She looked up at him without squinting, even though the morning sun was in her eyes. "I'm here about the cook position," she said. Bram looked at her. Then he looked at her shoes. The leather was nearly through at the toe of the right one, and the left had been re-soled at least once, with something that wasn't meant for shoe leather. "Where are you coming from?" he said. "Billings most recently," she said. "Before that, Forsyth. Before that, Miles City." "You walked from Billings?" "Part of it," she said, and her voice was even. No apology in it. He dismounted and stood in front of her, which put them about the same height. She didn't step back. "Can you cook?" he said. She held his eyes. "Give me 1 breakfast," she said. "If you don't keep me after that, I'll leave without an argument." Bram had heard plenty of people make promises they couldn't hold. But something in the way this woman said it, no performance, no pleading, just the plain offer made him consider it seriously. He was hungry. His men were hungry. The biscuits he'd made himself that morning tasted like chalk with good intentions. "Kitchen's through the back," he said. "We eat at 5:30. She nodded once, picked up her bundle, and walked toward the house. Bram watched her go, then looked back at Cutter, who had been watching the whole thing from the barn doorway. "You think she can cook?" Cutter called over. Bram shook his head. "No idea," he said, and he went back to the fence post. She could cook. That was the simple truth of it, and it hit the entire table at once like a change in weather. By 5:15 the next morning, the real morning, the pitch-dark kind that ranchers know, but that most other people sleep through, Maren had located every usable item in Bram's kitchen, identified what was spoiled, separated what needed to be used immediately from what could keep, started a fire in the iron stove, and begun working through a sequence of preparations that suggested she had been planning this meal since before she arrived at the gate. The men filed in at 5:30 the way they always did, half awake, scraping chairs, reaching for the coffee pot before they sat down. Jesse Crane, 22 and with a mouth that ran ahead of his manners, dropped into his seat, glanced at the new woman at the stove, and said to the man beside him, loud enough to carry, "Looks like Bram dragged in somebody's grandmother." The man beside him, a weathered hand named Polk, said nothing and reached for the bread. Then the food started coming out. Eggs cooked properly, not leathery, not wet in the middle, actually cooked the way eggs are supposed to be. Cornbread that was golden and held together when you picked it up. Thick-cut salt pork with some kind of spicing that nobody could identify immediately, but that made you eat faster without realizing it. Gravy over biscuits that were not chalk. Potatoes with something in them. Polk said it was onion. Jesse said it was something else. And then they both stopped talking because they were eating. All 12 of them ate without speaking for the better part of 10 minutes. Jesse picked up his second biscuit, looked at it, looked at Maren's back at the stove, and said nothing. Bram, at the head of the table, ate through the whole meal before he looked up. Then he set his fork down, folded his hands, and said, "What's your name?" Turned from the stove. "Maren Whitlock. Where'd you learn to cook like that?" "My mother taught me the basics," she said. "Everything else I figured out from necessity." Bram nodded slowly. "The position pays $40 a month and a room in the house. Sunday afternoons are yours." He paused. "You want the job?" Maren wiped her hands on her apron. "Yes," she said. And that was that. She moved into the small room off the kitchen that had been used for storage. It took her one afternoon to clear it out, another morning to scrub it down, and she brought nothing to it except the cloth bundle and a small oval mirror she set on the windowsill. The room was barely larger than the bed it contained. She seemed to consider it entirely adequate. Within her first week, she had reorganized the entire kitchen so that everything was where it made sense to be, which turned out not to be where it had been before. Cutter discovered this when he went to find the coffee on the third morning and had to ask. Over the stove now, Maren said without looking up from the bread dough she was working. "It was on the shelf," he said. "The shelf is too far from where you need it," she said. "Try it over the stove for a week and then tell me if it's worse." He tried it. It wasn't worse. He never mentioned it again. Bram noticed other things happening around the edges of his days. Stores in the cellar had been inventoried and reorganized by the end of the second week, and Maren had left him a written list on the kitchen table one morning, just a page, neat handwriting that itemized what they had, what they were short of, and what the delivery order had been costing against what it should have been costing. He read through it twice. "These prices," he said, the next time he passed through the kitchen. "From Hewitt Supply? You've been paying about a third above fair rate on most dry goods for at least 2 years," she said. The sugar in particular. She didn't look accusatory about it. Just factual, like she was reading weather. Bram pulled a chair out and sat at the kitchen table, which he almost never did. He usually took his meals at the main table with the men. Spread her list out in front of him. "How do you know what the fair rate is?" "I've been buying for 3 different households before this one," she said. "I know what things cost." He studied the list for a moment. "I'll send word to Hewitt. I already drafted the letter," she said, and set it in front of him. "You just need to sign it." He read it. The letter was reasonable, direct, not aggressive. It laid out the discrepancies and proposed a corrected rate going forward. It was the kind of letter a man with a lawyer might send. Bram looked up at her. Maren was already back at the stove, entirely occupied with whatever was next. He signs the letter. It was around the end of the third week that Jesse Crane made his second mistake regarding Maren Whitlock. He made the first one at the breakfast table. This one he made in the yard. Maren had gone out to bring in a delivery of flour, 2 large sacks that the supply wagon had left at the gate, and she was wrestling the first one toward the kitchen door when Jesse came around the corner of the barn. He stopped, watched her struggle with the sack for a moment, and then called over to 2 of the other hands who were crossing the yard. "Boys, look at that. You'd think a woman built like that could carry twice that without breaking a sweat." He grinned. "What's the matter, darling, too heavy?" The 2 other hands didn't laugh. One of them, a man called Dex, actually changed direction and walked over to take the second sack from where it sat at the gate. Maren had stopped walking. She stood in the yard with a flour sack in both arms, looking at Jesse. Her face was not angry. It was Bram would have called it, if he'd been there, considering. Like she was deciding how to file something. "Thank you, Dex," she said, and kept walking. Jesse's grin faded a little at the edges because she hadn't reacted the way he'd expected. What happened over the following month was quiet and relentless, and Jesse never fully understood it until it was done. The 2 ranch hands who had witnessed that morning quietly stopped including him in certain conversations. Quality of the food on the days Jesse was rude was not worse, exactly, but somehow less. Cornbread was drier, the gravy thinner. This was probably coincidence. Maren never said anything about it. She never looked at Jesse sideways or with meaning. She simply worked, and Jesse watched the rest of the crew stop finding his comments funny one by one, the way a fire stops burning room by room until the house is cold, and he couldn't point to the moment it happened. By the 6th week, Jesse was carrying flour sacks without being asked. He never mentioned this to anyone. The first time Bram Halloway sat at the kitchen table for a real conversation, not about the supply letter, not about the week's meals, it happened because he walked in for coffee at 7 in the evening and found Maren sitting there doing the household accounts. And he's tired and he didn't feel like going to sit in the front room alone. He poured his coffee and sat across from her. She glanced up, then went back to the accounts. For a while, neither of them said anything. The fire in the stove was low. Outside, the night had gotten cool, and the wind was picking up off the eastern ridge. "You do this every night," he said. "Most nights," she said. "Easier to stay current than to catch up." He looked at the ledger. "That's not just the kitchen accounts." She set her pen down. "I noticed there were some inconsistencies in the cattle records. I hope that's not overstepping." He leaned forward and looked. Cattle records from September were laid out with small annotations in red ink that marked discrepancies between what had been counted coming in from the summer range and what was recorded in the main ledger. "Where did you find those numbers?" "The tally sheets from the summer drive were in the storage chest in the hall," she said. "Cutter was looking for something in there and left it open." "I wasn't going through your records," she added, and her voice was clear on this. "I saw the sheets, and I noticed the figures didn't match what was in the accounts." Bram studied the annotations. He was quiet for a long time. "They don't match because 11 head went missing on the North Drive in July," he said finally. "I never got a clear answer on what happened to them." "Could have been drift," she said. "Could be something else." He looked up at her. "I'm not saying anything specific," she said. "I'm just saying the number is odd. 11 is a lot to lose to drift." He held her eyes for a moment. Then he looked back at the ledger. "Track of it," he said. She nodded and picked up her pen. He stayed at the table and drank his coffee, and after a while, they talked about other things as nothing important, just the texture of ordinary days. And when he left an hour later, couldn't have said why he felt less alone than he had in some time. The first time Thaddeus Crowell's name came up at Bram's table, it came up the way bad weather comes up, mentioned casually, then suddenly everywhere. It was Polk who brought it in, returning from a supply run to town, with news that Crowell had bought the old Beckett property on the valley's south edge, which put his land adjacent to Bram's eastern fence line for the first time. "That right," Bram said, and his face went flat in a way Maren hadn't seen before. "You know him," she said. "I know him," Bram said. He didn't elaborate. It was Cutter who told her more, later, out in the yard while he was working on a bridle and she was coming back from the garden. "Thaddeus Crowell's been buying up valley land for 12 years, Cutter said. "Sometimes it's a fair deal. Mostly it isn't. He finds a man with a weakness, a bad season, a debt, something personal, and he pressures until the man sells or walks. He's got 4 properties out east that used to belong to men who swore they'd never sell." He paused with the bridle in his hands. "Bram's land runs through the best grazing corridor in the North Valley. Crowell's been wanting it for years." "Is there a debt?" Maren asked. Cutter shook his head. "Bram doesn't owe Crowell anything." "Then why worry?" Cutter looked at her steadily. "Because with Crowell, debt doesn't have to be real. It just has to sound real long enough." Maren thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. When Thaddeus Crowell rode into the yard on a Thursday morning toward the end of October, Maren was in the kitchen. She heard the horses come in more than one, and she looked out the window and saw 3 riders, with Crowell at the front. She recognized him from description, a large man, well-fed, with the kind of ease in his body that came from years of never being physically threatened. He wore his wealth the way some men wore a hat naturally, like he'd never considered that it could be taken off. She went back to her work. Bram met them in the yard. Could hear the voices through the window, but not the words. Then the voices got louder. Then she heard Bram's voice at a register she hadn't heard before, controlled but tight, like rope under load. When the riders left 20 minutes later, Bram came inside. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands. "He's claiming I owe him $500 from a cattle deal in '84, Bram said. "Says he advanced money on a herd I sold him that came up short." "Did you?" "No," Bram said flatly. "There was no deal. He bought cattle from my father in '82, a fair transaction paid in full. There is no debt." Maren set down what she was holding. "What does he want you to do about it? Pay it or discuss other arrangements?" Bram's jaw was tight. "Other arrangements meaning sell him the North Grazing Corridor at his number." She was quiet for a moment. "He'll be back," she said. "Yes. And next time he'll bring something that looks like documentation." Bram stared at her. "Probably. Then we need to be ahead of him," she said. "Do you have the original sale records from your father's deal? Anything from that period?" He did, as it turned out. It took him the better part of an afternoon to find them in the ranch's old record chest, but they were there, handwritten ledger pages from his father's keeping, with the '82 Crowell transaction recorded clearly. Bram brought the pages to the kitchen table that evening. Maren read through them. Then she looked up. "This is clean. Fair price, full payment, no dispute recorded." "I know that," Bram said. "Crowell knows it, too. Then he isn't coming after a real debt," she said. "He's coming after your land. The debt is just the door." She picked up her own ledger. "So, from now on, we write down everything. Everything that happens on this property that doesn't sit right. Every piece of fence that breaks at a wrong time. Every gate that opens when it shouldn't. Every cow that doesn't come home." She looked at him. "If he's going to build a lie, I want to be building something true on the other side of it." Bram looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, and Maren Whitlock opened a new page and dated it. The trouble didn't come all at once. That was the particular cruelty of how Thaddeus Crowell operated. He pulled threads slowly, one at a time, so that each individual problem could be explained away as ordinary ranch misfortune. The first fence section went down in the first week of November. 3 cattle got through onto an adjacent property and had to be retrieved. Could have been weather. The posts were old. Bram made a note and Maren wrote it down. The second section went down 10 days later. This one was on the east side, near the line that now bordered Crowell's new property. 2 cattle were missing for 2 days before they were found wandering a gully 3 miles north. Bram came in from the fence repair with dried blood on one hand from where a wire had snapped back. "Same kind of break?" Maren said. He looked at his hand. Post was cut partway through at the base. Looked like it rotted, but the cut was too clean. She wrote it down. Jesse found the sabotaged water line in the 3rd week of November. Someone had driven a spike into the main line that fed the south stock tank, then packed mud around it so the leak was slow. By the time anyone noticed, the tank was low, and 20 cattle had been watering short for 2 days. Bram stood over the pipe with the spike in his hand, and he looked like a man who was deciding something. Not about the water line. I could ride over to Crowell's place tonight, Jesse said behind him. You could, Bram said. I'm saying I would, if you told me to. I know you would, Bram said. Go fix the line. That night, Maren was at the kitchen table when Bram came in late. He sat down across from her without a word. His face was doing something she was getting better at, reading the specific combination of patience and fury that he kept tightly managed, the way a man manages a fire in a controlled burn. He's waiting for you to ride over, she said. Bram looked at her. He wants you angry, she said. An angry man makes mistakes. An angry man who shows up at a neighbor's property after dark becomes the problem in everyone else's story. I know that, Bram said. I know you know it, she said. I'm saying it out loud, so it's said between both of us. She turned the ledger toward him. 3 pages now filled in her even hand. Dates, descriptions, estimated losses. Names of witnesses were available. This is what we have. Every time he does something, and we write it down instead of writing over angry, this gets stronger. And every time he looks at you and thinks you're just a rancher who's losing patience, he's wrong about what you're actually doing. Bram looked at the ledger for a long time. What am I actually doing, he said. Building a case, she said. The same way he's building one against you. Except ours is true. There was a silence in the kitchen that was different from the usual kind. Outside, the wind had come back off the ridge and was pushing at the edges of the house. My wife would have told me to ride over, Bram said, finally. Maren was quiet. She had a temper, he said. Both of us did. It was not always useful. He paused. She's been gone 6 years. My daughter, too. Fever, same winter. He had never told her this. He said it the way a man mentions something he has rehearsed in private, just to see how it sounds spoken aloud. I'm sorry, Maren said, and it was simple enough that he could hear it was true. I'm telling you because he stopped. Started again. Because I understand what it means to have everything taken from you without warning. And I'm not going to let this man take what's left. He looked at the ledger again. So keep writing. She kept writing. It was Cutter who first said out loud what everyone else on the ranch had been circling around without finding the words for. He said it to Polk out in the barn one afternoon, while Maren was in the kitchen and the sound of cooking came through the wall. She knows this ranch better than most men who've been here 5 years, Cutter said. Polk, working on a saddle, didn't look up. She's paying attention. She's doing more than paying attention, Cutter said. You know, Bram asked her about the east fence line last week, about where to put the new posts? She walked out there with him and told him exactly where the drainage problem was making the ground soft, and what needed to happen to fix it permanently. Looked up now. She's been watching, Cutter said. Not just the kitchen. All of it. Neither of them said the other thing. But they were both thinking it the way Bram looked when he came in from a hard day and found her at the table. The way he'd started eating supper in the kitchen instead of with the men. Small things. The kind of small things that didn't mean anything alone and started meaning something when they accumulated. The morning Thaddeus Crowell rode in and threw the stew pot into the yard happened without warning, the way violence always does when it finally steps out from behind suggestion. Maren had been up since before 4. The stew had been on since 5. By the time the light came fully through the east window, the kitchen smelled like beef and bay leaf and something warm that didn't have a name. She had been in a reasonable mood. The morning had been ordinary. And then she heard the horses. She heard the gate. She heard the particular sound of a horse ridden hard into a yard that it has no business being in, and she looked out the window in time to see Crowell swing down from the saddle before his horse had fully stopped. She turned back to the stove. She heard his boot against the door. And then Thaddeus Crowell was in her kitchen. He was a big man. In a large room, he would have been merely broad-shouldered. In her kitchen, he seemed to take up a particular kind of space, not physical space exactly, but the kind of space that certain men carry with them. That says, I decide what happens here. He looked at her. He looked at the pot on the stove. And something moved across his face, not anger, exactly. Something colder. Contempt, maybe. or the specific satisfaction of a man who has decided that humiliation is a tool and is about to use it. He walked to the stove. He picked up the pot with both hands. He threw it through the open kitchen door into the yard. The sound of it hitting the dirt, the heavy clang of iron, the slap of stew scattering across dry ground, was something Maren would remember for a long time, not because it frightened her, but because of what she felt in the 2 seconds after it. Nothing, and then clarity. Crowell looked at her. He was waiting for something. Tears, maybe. Outrage. Some kind of collapse. "Tell your boss I'll be back," he said. "For what he owes me. And tell him to send someone worth talking to." He turned and walked out of her kitchen. She listened to his horse leave the yard. Then she went to the shelf beside the window, took down her ledger, opened it to the next clean page, and wrote down the time. 7:22 in the morning. She wrote what had happened. She wrote what he said, word for word, as close as she could recall it. Wrote that 2 of the ranch hands had been within earshot at the grain shed and had heard the crash. Then she put the ledger down, went out to the yard, and began cleaning up the spilled stew. Cutter came out of the barn doorway and stood watching her. "You all right?" he said. "I'm fine," she said. "I need a bucket." He brought her a bucket. He crouched down and helped her collect what could be collected and dispose of what couldn't. "You're going to tell Bram," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "He's going to want to ride out." "I know," she said. "I'm going to ask him not to." Cutter looked at her sideways. "You think you can talk him out of it?" She wrung the cloth into the bucket and looked up at the ridge in the north, where the clouds were making the particular gray formation that meant snow in the next few days. "I think Bram Halloway is smarter than Thaddeus Crowell thinks he is," she said. "I just need him to believe that, too." Bram came back to the house at noon and found no stew and a clean kitchen floor. He stood in the kitchen doorway. "Where's the stew?" he said. "In the yard," Maren said. "Mostly." She put the ledger on the table and sat down across from the empty chair she'd left open for him. "Sit down." He looked at the ledger. He looked at her face. He sat, she told him. He didn't say anything for a long time. But his hands, flat on the table, were not flat in the way that meant calm. The tendons across his knuckles were raised. "He came into the house," Bram said. "Yes, into your kitchen." "Yes, a silence, Bram," she said. He looked at her. "I need you to hear what I'm going to say before you decide what to do." Jaw was tight. "Maren, I know," she said. "I know what you want to do. I understand it. But listen to me." She spread her hands on the table. "Came here today because he wanted a reaction. He wants you angry. He wants you to ride out to his property so that everyone in this valley remembers the day Bram Halloway showed up at Thaddeus Crowell's gate ready to fight. That becomes the story. That becomes the thing people repeat." She held his eyes. He threw a pot of stew on the ground. "I want that to be the story. Do you understand? I want people to remember that Thaddeus Crowell rode onto your land and threw food in the dirt like a bully at a schoolyard. That's the story I'm writing in this ledger, and I need you to let me keep writing it." Bram stared at her for a long moment. His hands hadn't moved. "He was in your kitchen," he said again, quieter this time. "Yes," she said, "and now his behavior is written down with the time and the witnesses and what he said. And the next time he does something, that will be written down too. Time after that." She paused. "You're a man, Bram. If you ride out there, this is a dispute between 2 men. That's the kind of thing that gets settled in ways that go badly. But I'm a cook who has kept your household accounts and noticed things nobody else thought to write down. When I walk into a room with this ledger and a list of witnesses, that's different. That's not something Thaddeus Crowell knows how to fight." Bram looked at the ledger. Then he looked at her. Then he unfolded his hands, very deliberately, and placed them flat on the table. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. "But Maren—" He stopped. He seemed to be choosing something. "If he comes into this house again, I'll write down every word he says, and I'll have 2 witnesses in the yard before he finishes his sentence," she said. He nodded slowly. Something in his face had shifted, not relaxed, exactly. But like a man who has decided to trust a different kind of weapon. "Make me something to eat," he said. "I have to go back to the east fence." She got up and went to the stove. He stayed at the table. And in the quiet of the kitchen, While the fire heated and the smell of fresh coffee filled the room, something settled between them that was less like employer and employee and more like two people who had decided to face the same direction. Neither of them named it, but it was there. The snow came early that year. It arrived in the second week of November as a thin crust that melted by mid-morning, then returned 3 days later as something more serious 2 inches overnight. The kind that stayed in the shadows until past noon and made the ground harder than it looked. Bram's men worked in it without complaint because that was what ranch hands in Montana did, but the cold slowed everything, and the shortened days meant repairs that should have taken an afternoon stretched into 2. The east fence needed 6 new posts after another section went down in a windstorm. The south water line that Jesse had spiked back together was holding, but only just, and Bram knew it would need to be replaced before hard winter set in, or they'd lose it when the ground froze and expanded around the joint. Maren watched all of this from the kitchen and from her increasing presence at the edges of ranch work, and she adjusted accordingly. The meals got heavier, more beef, more fat, more of the dense cornbread that the men could eat fast and feel for hours. She made a double batch of something she called working soup, which was really just a large pot of whatever was available in the cellar, held together by bone broth and black pepper, and she kept it on the back of the stove from noon onward, so anyone coming in cold could eat without waiting. She didn't announce this. She just started doing it, and within 4 days, it had become a fact of the ranch the same way the barn and the fence line were facts of the ranch. Jesse Crane ate 3 bowls of it one afternoon after coming in from post-work with his hands too stiff to unbutton his coat. He stood at the stove and ate without sitting down, because he didn't want to take off his boots, and he knew Maren would look at him sideways for tracking mud to the table. She was at the counter doing something with dried apples, and she didn't look up. "This is good," he said. "I know," she said. He ate the 3rd bowl and didn't say anything else. Neither did she. By some unspoken agreement, they had arrived at a kind of mutual tolerance that neither of them would have called warmth, but that functioned well enough. What was changing more slowly and more deeply was the arrangement between Maren and Bram. It was not dramatic. That was the thing about it, the complete absence of drama in how it happened. He was in the kitchen. Then he was in the kitchen more often. He asked her things that had nothing to do with food or household management. He told her things that had nothing to do with the ranch. One evening he brought in a letter from his brother in Ohio and read her a passage from it that had made him laugh. And she laughed too, and they stayed at the table talking about nothing that mattered for almost an hour. When she looked up at the clock and said it was late, he looked genuinely surprised, the way a man looks when time has done something he didn't expect. He started leaving the door between the front room and the kitchen open in the evenings, which he hadn't done before. None of the men said anything about it directly. Cutter noticed. Even Jesse noticed, though he processed it more slowly. But it was the kind of thing that, on a working ranch, people understood as their own business to mind. The ledger was getting full. By the end of November, Maren had 14 entries, and not all of them were dramatic. Some were simply odd: a gate on the north pasture found open on a Tuesday morning when every man on the ranch swore they'd latched it the night before. 3 fence staples pulled clean on the southeast corner, not loosened by weather but removed, the holes in the wood clean and deliberate. A supply delivery that arrived short by 200 pounds of grain that the supplier's record said had been sent. Small things. Individually, each one could be explained. Together, they were a pattern you could trace with a finger. She showed the pattern to Bram on a Sunday evening, when the house was quiet and the men were in the bunkhouse. She laid the ledger open on the table and walked him through it without editorializing. Just the dates, the events, the estimates of loss. Bram looked at it for a long time without speaking. His face was doing the thing it did, the controlled management of what was underneath. She had learned to read the specific version of it that meant he was thinking rather than suppressing. 11 incidents in 3 weeks, he said finally. 14, she said. 3 are smaller. I wasn't sure if you'd count them. Count them, he said. Then 14. He sat back in the chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way people do when they're doing arithmetic in their head. Then, what does it cost total? She turned to the back of the section where she'd done the estimates. She had been conservative, rounding losses down when there was uncertainty, noting her methodology in small print at the margin the way she'd seen her father do when he kept books for the grain elevator in the town where she'd grown up. He read the total. He was quiet. "That's before the waterline repair," she said. "I know. And before accounting for the feed deficit from the short delivery, if the cattle come up light this winter." "I know, Maren." She closed the ledger. "You need to talk to the sheriff." He looked at her sharply. "On what basis? None of this proves Crowell ordered anything. He'd say it was weather and bad luck and a cook with a grudge." "I know that," she said. "I'm not saying go in and make an accusation. I'm saying go in and establish a record, a formal one, outside this ledger, so that when something larger happens, if something larger happens." "When," she said, and her voice was even enough that he didn't argue it. "When something larger happens, there is already a document at the sheriff's office that predates it. That's not the same as an accusation. It's a timeline. Timelines matter." Bram rubbed the back of his neck. "Sheriff Aldous is a fair man. He's also not going to want to go up against Thaddeus Crowell without considerably more than this." "I'm not asking him to go up against anyone," she said. "I'm asking you to walk in, tell him what you've documented, and leave a copy. That's all." She paused. "Will you do that?" He looked at her. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen clearly before, not resistance, but the particular weariness of a man who has been the kind of strong that doesn't ask for help for so long, that asking now feels like a different language. "You're very sure about this," he said. "I'm sure about the pattern," she said. "And I'm sure that you doing nothing is what Crowell is counting on." Quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once and pushed back from the table. He rode into town the following Wednesday and was back before dark. He came into the kitchen and set his hat on the hook, without looking at her immediately, which was how she knew the conversation hadn't been simple. "Aldous took the copy," Bram said. "He read it. And he said he's had 2 other ranchers in the North Valley mention Crowell's name this year. One sold, one is still holding." He paused. "He said that without direct evidence of who's doing the sabotage, there's not much legal ground. But he's watching." "Good," she said. "He asked who kept the records." "What did you tell him?" "The truth," Bram said. He looked at her now. "He seemed to think you had a cleaner hand at this than most men he'd worked with." Maren turned back to the stove. She didn't say anything, but something in the line of her shoulders shifted slightly, the way a rope shifts when the tension on it is redistributed. "He's right," Bram said. "For what it's worth." "It's worth something," she said, and left it at that. It was the 3rd week of December when the cattle disappeared. 40 head, gone from the north pasture overnight. The snow on the ground meant tracks, but the tracks went 3 different directions and dispersed into the rocky ground north of the creek where they were impossible to follow cleanly. 2 of Bram's men spent the better part of 2 days trying to track them. They found 8 cattle in a gully 6 miles east, disoriented and thin. The other 32 were not found. Bram stood in the north pasture in the cold, with his breath making clouds and his face doing something different this time. Not controlled, not suppressed, just stripped down to something plain and hard. Jesse was beside him. "I know 3 men who'd ride with us tonight." "No questions." "No," Bram said. He said it quietly, and that was worse than saying it loud. Jesse stopped talking. Bram came back to the kitchen that evening and sat down at the table. And for the first time since Maren had arrived, he looked tired in a way that went past the body. She poured him coffee and sat across from him and didn't say anything for a while. 32 cattle, he said eventually. "At current prices, that's—" "I know what it is," she said. "I ran the numbers." He looked at the ledger she had already updated. The entry was long and detailed. She had spoken to both of the men who'd tried to track, gotten their best description of the track patterns, noted the direction of dispersal, estimated the time window based on the last count versus the discovery. She had already added it to the cumulative loss total at the back. Bram read through it without speaking. "The pattern of dispersal," she said. 3 directions. That's not accident or panic from a predator. Cattle scatter from a predator in one direction. 3 directions means they were driven. He nodded. He already knew this. Someone knew the layout of that pasture, she continued. Knew where the fence gaps were. knew which direction to push them to lose the tracks in the rocky ground. She paused. That's not a stranger passing through. Bram set the ledger down. Someone who's been watching this ranch. Or someone who's been on it, she said. They looked at each other. You think one of my men? He stopped. I don't know, she said honestly. I think it's possible someone on this property gave information to someone working for Cruel. Not necessarily on purpose. Not necessarily someone disloyal. She chose her next words carefully. Crowell could have someone in town. Someone who talks to your men when they come in for supplies. Someone asking innocent questions that add up. Bram's jaw tightened. How do I find that? Carefully, she said, and not by confronting anyone directly. She thought for a moment. Let me handle the supply runs for a while. He frowned. What does that accomplish? If someone is feeding information through the supply trips, then what gets said on those trips shapes what comes back here. I can control what goes in, and I can watch what comes back. She met his eyes. You need to trust me to do this the way I see fit. He looked at her for a long, steady moment. Outside, the wind had found something to push against at the north corner of the house and was making its unhappy sound around the eaves. All right, he said. She went to town for supplies twice in the following 2 weeks, and both times she paid attention to everything. Who was at the supply store when she came in? Who spoke first? What questions were dressed up as friendly conversation? The second time, she noticed a man she hadn't seen before, youngish, wearing ranch clothes that were clean enough to suggest he wasn't currently working a ranch, sitting near the door of the dry goods store and watching the street. He looked at her when she came in. He looked at her when she left. It was not the look of a man being casual. She noted his description in the ledger that evening. Don't know him, Bram said when she described the man. But the description fits someone Cutter mentioned seeing near the east fence line 2 weeks ago. He thought it was a traveler. He may be, Maren said. Or he may be someone Crowell pays to watch. Bram went quiet. Then I feel like I'm in a fight I can't see the edges of. You are, she said. That's how he wants it. And what do we do about it? We keep building our side of it, she said, and we get neighbors involved. He looked up. The ranchers you mentioned, the ones Aldous said, are having trouble with Crowell. They're not going to stand up individually. But if 3 ranchers walk into the sheriff's office with 3 separate documented records of the same kind of interference, she let him finish the thought. He finished it. That's not one angry rancher with a grudge. That's a pattern. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. I'd have to reach out to them. Carefully, without Crowell finding out we're talking. I know, she said. Can you do that? Fletcher Ames has been my neighbor for 11 years, Bram said. And Walt Gruder's wife was a friend of my wife's. He paused on that. For just a moment, she saw it move across his face and go. I can reach out. Do it soon, she said. He reached out. It took time. Fletcher Ames was cautious by nature and took 2 meetings before he would say anything direct. And Walt Gruder was managing his own set of difficulties that winter that had nothing to do with Crowell and everything to do with a sick herd and a barn roof that hadn't survived the first snow. But by the 3rd week of December, Bram had sat with both men privately, and both men had confirmed what Maren had suspected. Crowell had approached each of them in the past year with variations of the same strategy. Invented or inflated debts. Pressure dressed up as negotiation. Infrastructure damage that stopped just short of being provable. Ames had a ledger of his own, less organized than Maren's, but present. Gruder had kept nothing, but his memory was clear, and his anger was controlled in the same way Bram's was, which meant it had been building for a long time, and had nowhere to go. Bram came back from the second meeting with Gruder, and came straight to the kitchen, and stood at the counter eating leftover cornbread standing up, which he did when he was too preoccupied to sit. He's doing it to all of us, Bram said, at the same time. Running 3 separate campaigns at once. He has the resources, Maren said. Patient. He's been doing this for years. Ames almost sold in September. He had the papers ready. Bram set down the cornbread. His wife talked him out of it. Good wife, Maren said. Good wife, he agreed. He looked at her. You want to see Gruder's account of it? He wrote it down after I asked him to. Yes, she said. And I want to compare the timing of his incidents with ours. Crowell is coordinating this. There may be a rhythm to it. Times of month when the pressure increases. Times when it backs off. Bram pulled out the folded paper Gruder had given him and laid it on the table. She spread it open and began reading, running her finger along the dates and making small notations in pencil at the margin. He watched her work for a moment. "When you were in those other towns," he said. "Miles City, Forsyth. What happened?" "You don't have to tell me," he added quickly. She didn't look up from the paper. "My employer was a hardware merchant named Culver Baines. He died in August. Heart, they said. His brother came in from back east and decided the household accounts showed a discrepancy. He accused me of taking money." She paused. "I hadn't. The discrepancy was his own brother's poor record-keeping over 3 years, which I could have demonstrated if anyone had been interested in the demonstration. They weren't. They took his word over yours," Bram said. "He was the family. I was the cook." She said it without bitterness, which was somehow more specific than bitterness. "So I left, and in the next town the story had gotten there ahead of me. People talk. Merchants talk. By the time I reached Forsyth, someone had already told someone that a cook from Miles City had been let go for theft." She finally looked up. "I spent 7 weeks trying to work my way back to a clean reference. Couldn't do it, so I started walking." Bram was quiet. "I'm telling you because you asked," she said. "Not because I want you to feel differently about it." "I don't feel differently about it," he said. "I feel—" He stopped. "Try it again. It makes me angry, on your behalf." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "Thank you." And she went back to the paper. 2 days before Christmas, the water line broke. Not the patched one on the south. The main one, running from the creek to the house and the stock tanks, the primary line that everything on the ranch depended on. It broke at 3 in the morning, in the freeze, in a section of pipe that ran underground along the west side of the house, and nobody noticed until Maren got up at 4 to start the kitchen fire and found no water at the pump. She went outside in the dark with a lantern to check the line junction. The ground near the west foundation was wrong softer than it should be, even in freeze, which meant water had been seeping upward through the soil for some time. She checked the main shutoff. Then she went to the bunkhouse and knocked until Cutter came to the door with his boots unlaced and a lamp in his hand. "Main line's gone on the west side," she said. "We'll need to shut off the upper junction before first light, or we'll lose the line pressure to the stock tanks." Cutter stared at her for a moment in the lamplight. "How bad?" "I don't know yet. But it's not weather. Pipe's been running fine in colder temperatures. Something cracked it or cut it. He woke 3 men. By the time Bram came out from the house, they had found the break a clean cut, not a crack, in a section of pipe that had been exposed at a shallow joint near the house foundation. Someone had known exactly where the joint was. Someone had known that cutting it there would cause the slowest possible seep, the kind that would take hours to manifest at the pump and would be hardest to isolate in frozen ground. Bram crouched in the dark with a lantern over the cut pipe and looked at it for a long time. "That's not weather," Jesse said behind him. "No," Bram said. Maren was standing back, watching not the pipe, but Bram's face. She saw the thing happen that she had been watching for the thing she'd been afraid of since the cattle disappeared. The break in the patience. Not anger exactly. Something quieter and more dangerous. The particular stillness that comes before a decision. "Bram," she said. He stood. He looked at her. "Don't," she said. Quietly. "Just that." He held her eyes for a moment that stretched long enough that she wasn't sure which way it would go. Then he looked at Cutter. "Get the repair tools. We'll fix what we can before the tanks drop too low." He didn't go anywhere. He stayed and worked the repair with the men for 3 hours in the frozen dark, and when the line was holding again and the tanks were stabilized. He came inside with mud on his coat and frost on his collar and sat down at the kitchen table while Maren poured coffee. He wrapped both hands around the mug. "I want to go out there," he said. Not to her, really. Just said. "I know," she said. Every time he does something like this, he stopped. It would feel better. For about an hour. And then it would be worse, he said. He didn't sound happy about knowing this. He sounded like a man who has learned a true thing he would have preferred not to know. "You were right about that. From the beginning. I was afraid I was right," she said. That's different from being pleased about it. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression, appreciation, maybe. The specific kind that comes from being understood correctly rather than just agreed with. The neighbors are ready to go to Aldous, she said. Christmas. You should all three go in together. I know, he said. And Bram, the man I saw in town. I think we need to find out who he's working for. He nodded slowly. I have an idea about that. There's a writer who's been between jobs since fall. Knows the valley, knows the faces. I could ask him to pay attention. Don't tell him why, she said. I know, he said, faintly annoyed, which she found oddly reassuring. He was himself again. I'm not new to being careful. No, she said. You're not. Christmas came and went with less ceremony than sentiment. Maren made a better meal than the ranch had probably seen in years, slow-roasted beef that had been marinating since the 23rd, a potato gratin that Cutter declared the best thing he'd eaten since his mother's table, and a dried apple cake with a whiskey sauce that made Jesse Crane put down his fork and simply look at it for a moment like it had surprised him. Bram sat at the head of the table with his men, and he laughed twice and meant it both times, which Maren noted as quietly significant given everything that had been accumulating. After supper, when the men had gone and the kitchen was washed and quiet, Bram came back in from putting wood on the fire in the front room and stopped in the kitchen doorway. Maren was sitting at the table with her ledger closed in front of her for once, just sitting, with a cup of tea going cold at her elbow. She was looking at nothing in particular. You all right? He said. Fine, she said. Just tired. He pulled out a chair and sat. You've been working since before 4 in the morning. I'm always working since before 4 in the morning, she said. Today was different. She looked at him. I suppose it was. She wrapped her hands around the cold cup. I haven't spent Christmas with anyone in 3 years, she said. It's different when there are people. He was quiet for a moment. Then I used to hate this day. After he stopped. After. I used to find things to do outside so I didn't have to be inside where everything reminded me. She didn't say anything. She let it be said. Tonight wasn't like that, he said. She held his eyes. I'm glad, she said. He nodded once. Got up, said good night, and went to bed. Maren sat in the kitchen alone for a while after, with the fire ticking in the stove and the wind doing its thing outside, and she thought about the particular strangeness of a life that could go from everything lost to something almost found, in the space of a few months on a ranch in Montana. She thought about the ledger. 14 incidents, 32 cattle, 1 cut water line, and somewhere out there, Thaddeus Crowell sitting in whatever he called a house, looking at his own version of the numbers and deciding what came next. She picked up her pen and wrote the date on a new page. She didn't know what he was going to do next, but she was going to be ready when he did it. The new year came in cold and mean, the way Montana winters sometimes decided to remind people who was actually in charge. January opened with a 3-day blow that kept everyone inside except for the essential runs to the stock tanks in the barn, and Maren used the forced stillness to reorganize the root cellar, recalculate the winter feed estimates against what they actually had on hand, and write 4 pages of notes in the back of the ledger about patterns she'd been noticing but hadn't had time to think through cleanly. She wrote in small handwriting to save space, the way her father had taught her when paper was something you didn't waste, and by the time the wind broke, on the 3rd day she had a clearer picture of Thaddeus Crowell's rhythm than she'd had before. He moved in cycles. That was the thing she'd been sensing without being able to name it. Incidents, the fence cuts, the gate openings, the water line, the cattle, they didn't come randomly. They came in clusters of 2 or 3 over a period of 5 to 7 days, followed by a quiet stretch of 10 days to 2 weeks where nothing happened. Quiet stretches weren't relief. They were pressure of a different kind. The kind that made a man start to wonder if he'd imagined the pattern. Start to relax. Start to lower his guard just enough. She showed her notes to Bram on the 4th of January, when the weather had cleared enough to breathe. He read them standing at the kitchen counter, still in his coat from the morning chores, and when he looked up his expression had the particular quality of a man who has been handed a piece of information that rearranges other things. 10 to 14 days, he said. On average, she said. The shortest quiet stretch was 8 days. The longest was 16, but that was over the Christmas period, and I think that was coincidence of timing rather than intent. So we're 6 days into the current quiet stretch, he said. 7, as of this morning. He looked at her. You think something is coming? I think something is always coming, she said. But yes. Within the next week, probably. And I think it will be larger than what's come before. He set her notes down. Why larger? Because the smaller things haven't worked, she said. You haven't sold. You haven't ridden over there angry. You haven't made a mistake he could use. He's been escalating gradually, but nothing has broken you, so the next step has to be something that changes the equation. Bram was quiet for a moment. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. What would you do? If you were him? She had already thought about this. Something that damages your reputation, not just your property. Cattle and the water line hurt you financially. But financially, you're still standing. What he needs now is something that makes people in this valley doubt you. Doubt your judgment. Doubt whether you're the kind of man who can hold this ranch. She paused. He'll come at your character, or he'll come at something you care about. Bram was very still. Both of those things at once if he's smart, she added. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, what do we do? The 3 of you go to Obese this week, she said. Not next week. This week, before the next cycle starts. And when you go, I want you to take copies of everything Ames's records. Gruder's account, my ledger. All of it. She folded her hands on the table. And I want Aldous to understand that this is not 3 separate complaints. This is one coordinated campaign. Bram nodded slowly. I'll send word to Ames and Gruder today. They went on a Thursday, all 3 of them riding into town together, which was in itself a statement to anyone who saw 3 neighboring ranchers who didn't usually travel in company, side by side on a cold January morning. Bram had debated whether the visibility was useful or dangerous and had decided, after talking it through with Maren, that it was useful. Let Crowell's people see it. Let word get back. Let him know that the isolation strategy wasn't working. Maren stayed at the ranch. She didn't love staying. But someone needed to be there, and she was the one who had the clearest picture of what they needed Aldous to understand. So the night before she'd sat with Bram for 2 hours at the kitchen table and walked him through it. What to say first, what to show when, which of the ledger entries were most significant for a legal mind, and which ones were significant for her purposes, but would mean little to the sheriff. She had marked the key entries with a small red mark in the corner. He'll ask about motive, she said. Have a clean answer. Land, Bram said, the north grazing corridor. Specifically, she said. Don't just say land. Say the north corridor between Halloway and Gruder's east fence controls access to the best seasonal grazing in this part of the valley. Whoever holds that corridor controls where the other ranchers can run their summer herds. Crowell already holds the south approach. If he gets the corridor, he effectively controls the grazing calendar for 6 ranches, not just mine. Bram looked at her. How do you know about the grazing calendar? Cutter told me, she said. Last October. I asked him why Crowell wanted your land specifically when there were other properties closer to his. Bram was quiet for a moment. You've been thinking about this since October. I've been thinking about everything since October, she said, without particular emphasis. It was just true. They were back by late afternoon. Bram came into the kitchen first, ahead of the other 2, and his face told her something before he said anything. He's going to open a formal file, Bram said. Maren let out a breath she hadn't quite realized she was holding. All 3 ranches? All 3. He's treating it as a single case of coordinated interference. He pulled his coat off and hung it. It was, I don't know, more serious than I expected. He said he'd been watching Crowell's acquisitions for 2 years. Said there were rumors about how the Beckett property sale went, but nobody had brought him documentation before. What about the man I saw in town, she said, the one near the dry goods store. I described him. Aldous knows who he is. Says his name is Rudell Pate, does odd work for Crowell during the winter months. He sat down. Not enough to hold him on. But Aldous knows the name. That's enough for now, she said. Ames and Gruder stayed for supper. Maren fed them without being asked, the way she fed everyone, with the specific competence of someone for whom hospitality was not a performance but a habit. Ames ate quietly and seemed relieved in a way he was too careful to name directly. Gruder talked more than usual, which Maren recognized as the loosening that happened when a man has been carrying something alone and has just put part of it down. After they left, Bram came back to the kitchen where she was finishing the wash-up. Gruder's wife asked about you, he said. Maren looked up. She doesn't know me. She asked who kept the records for my place. Said Aldous mentioned it, that a woman on your ranch had the most organized documentation he'd seen on a case like this. He paused. She said to tell you she'd like to meet you. Maren looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to the dishes. Tell her I'd like that too, she said. 8 days into the quiet cycle, it broke. It broke before dawn on a Saturday morning in a way that none of them were expecting, though Maren had been sleeping lightly for 3 nights in anticipation of something. What woke her was not a sound from outside, but an absence of the right sounds, the particular change in the night air that her body had learned on the ranch, the way the cold differently when something wasn't right. She was at the window before she was fully awake. The storage building beside the kitchen, the one that held the winter food stocks, the preserved goods, the grain reserves, the tools was on fire. Not starting to burn. Already burning, the way a building burns when fire has been in it for a while before anyone sees it, the roof already going, the wallboards orange with heat. She threw open her door. Fire, she was already moving down the hall. Bram fire. The storage building, she didn't wait. She went outside in her work dress, with her boots unlaced, and ran toward the building, assessing as she moved. The fire was concentrated on the east wall, and the roof it had started on the outside. She could see that from the char pattern, and the kitchen itself was not yet in danger, but would be if the east wall went completely. The wind was coming from the northwest, which was the only thing working in their favor. The bunkhouse was already stirring. She heard Cutter's voice, then Jesse's, then the particular organized noise of men who work hard physical jobs responding to emergency, not panic, just fast. Somebody rang the iron triangle at the bunkhouse door, the sound cutting through the dark and the cold. Bram came out of the house, pulling his coat on with one hand and carrying the water bucket from the kitchen with the other. He stopped for half a second when he saw the building, and she saw his face in the firelight, not fear, but a specific kind of fury that was worse than fear. Waterline, he said. Who has the waterline? Dex and Polker on it, Cutter called from across the yard. They fought the fire for 2 hours. They saved the building. Barely. The east wall was gone and the roof over that quarter was destroyed, and everything stored in that corner, 2 months of grain reserve, a significant portion of the preserved goods. The better set of fence tools was either burned or smoke damaged past use. But the structure stood. The kitchen was untouched. When the last of the flames were beaten down to smoldering and the gray early light was coming over the eastern ridge, Maren stood in the yard with soot on her face, and her hair half fallen from its pins, and her hands shaking from 2 hours of hauling water and beating at the edges of the fire with wet sacking. She was looking at what was left of the east wall when Bram came up beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at what she looked at. Then he said, "You're bleeding." She looked down. Her right hand, where she'd been gripping the wet sacking, had a burn across the palm from where a piece of falling timber had glanced off it. She hadn't noticed. "It's not bad," she said. "Come inside," he said. "The men Cutter has the men," he said. His voice was not loud, but it had something in it that she recognized as the thing past argument. "Come inside." She came inside. He sat her at the kitchen table and found the tin of salve she kept on the shelf by the stove and wrapped her hand himself, which he did with more care than she would have given the injury on her own. He didn't talk while he did it. Neither did she. The kitchen smelled of smoke that had come in under the door, and the coffee she'd had on before everything started, and the particular cold that follows a fire. When he finished, he didn't move away immediately. He was still holding her hand loosely, and she was aware of it in a way that was distinct from the awareness of the injury. "He said it," Bram said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," she said. "Before dawn." Deliberately. "On the east wall where it would take the longest to see from the house." "Yes." His jaw was tight. I know what you want to do," she said. "Don't tell me not to yet," he said, and there was something raw in his voice that she hadn't heard before. "Give me a minute." She didn't say anything. She sat still with his hands around hers and let him have the minute. He breathed. Outside, she could hear the men moving in the yard, the specific sounds of aftermath exhaustion, assessment, the beginning of figuring out what comes next. Okay, he said finally. Okay, she said. He let go of her hand. Tell me what we do. We send word to Aldous today, she said. Not next week. Today. This is arson. That's a different order of crime than cut fence posts and missing cattle. I know. And we need to find out who was near this property last night. She looked at her wrapped hand. Someone set that fire. That means someone was close enough to do it without the dogs raising enough alarm to wake us earlier. Someone who knew how to move around this ranch quietly. Bram stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the ruined east wall, visible from the kitchen, the timbers still smoking faintly in the cold morning air. Rudell Pate, he said. Maybe, she said. Or someone like him. Aldous needs to know. She paused. Bram, this is the larger thing I was expecting. He's gone past intimidation. He set fire to a building with people in the house. Bram turned from the window. His face was doing the stripped-down thing again, the thing past management, past the controlled version of himself. He could have killed you, he said. His voice was quiet, and that was what made it land differently. She looked at him. The kitchen is 20 feet from that building, he said. If the wind had been different if you hadn't woken. But I did, she said. That's not the point, he said. Point is that he is no longer just coming after my land. He stopped. He looked at her with an expression that was several things at once, and that she didn't immediately know how to categorize. He came after you. The kitchen was very quiet. He came after what you've built, she said carefully. The food stores, the resources. No, Bram said. His voice was steady, and that made it more serious, not less. He came after you. He knows what you've been doing. He knows what those records mean, and he wanted to He stopped again. Tried a different direction. 6 years ago, when Clara and my daughter died, I told myself I was never going to be in a position to lose someone again. I have kept that very deliberately. He was looking at her directly. And then you showed up at my gate with a cloth bundle and your shoes worn through. And somewhere in the last 3 months, that arrangement of mine fell completely apart, and I don't know exactly when it happened. Maren was very still. I'm not saying this well, he said. You're saying it fine, she said. He looked at her. Something moved through his face. I'm not in a position to say it properly. Not while he's still out there and this ranch is still under threat, and you have a burned hand and there's a ruined wall in my yard. He pulled back slightly, not physically, but in the way people pull back when they've said more than they planned to. But I needed to say something. I know, she said. I heard it. He nodded once. Then he looked out the window again, at the smoke and the ruin and the daylight that was fully up now, cold and clear. I'm going to ride to Aldous myself, he said, today. Good, she said. And while I'm gone, Cutter stays close to the house. She started to say something about not needing supervision. Not for you, he said, knowing exactly what she was going to say. For the property. Someone needs to be here who knows what to look for. All right, she said. He rode out within the hour. Maren sat with the ledger and wrote the morning's events, while the details were still sharp the time she'd woken, the fire's location and spread pattern, what the char indicated about the point of origin, the wind direction, the approximate temperature, which men had responded, in what order, the estimated loss of stores. She wrote it in the same plain handwriting she always used, without drama, without adjectives that didn't carry factual weight. When she was done, she read it back and added 3 things she'd missed. Then she made breakfast for the men. Jesse came in from the yard with ash on his coat and dark circles under his eyes and sat down at the table without his usual commentary. You all right? Maren said. He looked up. He seemed to consider the question genuinely, which was not his usual approach to questions. That building goes up another hour before we catch it, and we lose the kitchen too, he said. Lose the kitchen in January. This whole operation starts folding. I know, she said. Whoever set that fire knew that, he said. She put food in front of him. He looked at it and then looked up at her. This is somebody's job, he said. This isn't just Crowell being greedy about land. This is somebody's actual occupation. Burning out ranches. Think so, she said. Jesse picked up his fork. Set it down. picked it up again. "You're not scared," he said. It wasn't an accusation. More like he was trying to understand something. "I'm scared," she said. "I just don't have the luxury of stopping." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he ate. Bram was back by mid-afternoon. He came in with Sheriff Aldous. Aldous was a compact man in his 50s with a gray mustache and the particular kind of patience that develops in a man who has spent many years listening to people tell him things that only made sense if you also knew what they weren't saying. He walked the yard with Bram and looked at the fire damage with careful eyes, and he crouched down at the point of origin that Maren had identified and looked at it for a long time without comment. Then he came into the kitchen. Maren set coffee on the table and sat across from him. She put the ledger in front of him and opened it to the fire entry. He read it. He read the 3 pages before it. He turned back to the beginning and read the first entry, then moved forward methodically. He was the kind of man who read slowly, not because he was slow, but because he was thorough. When he finished, he looked up. "You noted the wind direction," he said. "Northwest," she said. "If it had been east or south, the fire reaches the kitchen in under an hour." "Somebody knew the building layout," he said. "Someone who'd been watching this property," she said. "Or someone who's been on it." He looked at the entry she'd made about Rudell Pate. "Read it twice. You got a physical description. Medium height, brown coat, dark hat, watching the street from inside the dry goods store. Looked at me coming in and going out. He was not shopping." Aldous sat back. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man assembling something. "I've got your ledger, Ames's records, Gruder's account, and now this." He paused. "What I don't have is a direct link between Crowell and any specific act. Everything here is documented. It's good documentation, but it's circumstantial." "A good lawyer would say weather and bad luck," Maren said. "I know. I need a person," Aldous said, "someone who was there. Someone who can put Crowell's instructions in someone else's hands." Kitchen was quiet. "Rudell Pate," Bram said. "If it was Pate who set the fire," Aldous said, "and if we can prove it, then Pate becomes that person. If he'll talk." He looked at Maren. "You think he'll talk?" "I think anyone will talk if the alternative is an arson conviction, and the people who hired you walk free," she said. "I think it depends on whether he believes Crowell will protect him." Aldous nodded. He looked at the ledger once more. "I'm going to keep this copy. I'll send word to the county seat. This is past what I can handle alone." He looked at Bram. "I want you to be patient a little longer." Bram's face was carefully arranged. "How much longer? Days, not weeks." Aldous stood. "And in the meantime, you keep writing," he said to Maren. "I haven't stopped," she said. The patience Aldous asked for lasted 6 days. On the 6th day, Thaddeus Crowell rode into Bram Halloway's yard with 5 men. It was mid-morning, clear sky, hard cold. The kind of day that made everything sharp sounds carried farther. Shadows were definite. The light had no softness in it at all. Maren was in the kitchen. She heard the horses from the window and looked out and saw the 6 riders come through the gate in a loose formation with Crowell at the front. She saw the way they spread out slightly when they entered the yard, not bunching the way social visitors would bunch, but fanning into the space with a particular arrangement of men who have been positioned rather than arriving naturally. Turned from the window, untied her apron, and stepped into the front hall. "Bram," she said. He was in the room off the hall. He appeared in the doorway. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and they both understood without saying it. He went out. She followed, stopping at the porch edge. Crowell had dismounted. His 5 men had not. They sat their horses in the yard in a spread that covered the mouth of the gate and the angles to the barn. Cutter was visible near the barn doorway, still watching. Jessie was somewhere she couldn't see. Dex had come around from the grain shed. "Halloway," Crowell said. His voice was large, and he didn't bother modulating it. He wanted it heard. "I'm here to settle this." "There's nothing to settle," Bram said. He'd stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He didn't go further into the yard. He also didn't step back. $500, Crowell said. "That's all this is. You pay what you owe, and we're done." "I don't owe you $500, Bram said. "I've never owed you $500. The only transaction between my family and yours was paid in full in 1,882. Crowell smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that a powerful man uses when he wants you to know he knows something about you that you don't know he knows. Boy, I have documentation that says different. Then your documentation is wrong, Bram said. Forged. The smile didn't change. That's a serious word to use. It's an accurate one. Crowell looked past Bram then. Looked directly at Maren, standing at the porch edge. She didn't move. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the stew pot before he threw it that specific cold contempt. The calculation of a man deciding what will do the most damage. I hear you've been busy, he said to her. Directly. She didn't answer. Making yourself indispensable. He turned it into something ugly with the tone. Homeless woman wanders in from the road, makes herself at home in a widower's house. Gets her hands into the accounts. Writes things down. He glanced at his men, an invitation to a shared understanding. Remarkable situation. For a cook. Whatever you have to say about my ranch, Bram said, you can say to me. I'm talking to your cook, Crowell said. He turned back to Maren. Word gets around, you know, about people, about where they came from, about why they left their last position. He paused. There's a hardware man's widow in Miles City who says some things about you that I wouldn't repeat in polite company. Maren's face was warm. She could feel it, not tears, not shame, but the specific heat of being publicly reduced by someone who has done their research and selected their weapon. She stood in the cold without looking away from him. Her husband's brother said things, she said. Her voice was steady. He was wrong, and he said them because it was easier than explaining his brother's poor bookkeeping to a widow who needed answers. Crowell's eyes flickered. He hadn't expected her to answer at all. Seems like you've got a pattern, he said, moving from house to house. Older men, wealthy men. He let that sit in the air. And now you've got your hands deep into this one's business. He looked at Bram. No wonder you can't think straight, with this woman managing everything from your minutes. Stop, Bram said. Crowell stopped. Not because the word was loud. Because it wasn't. Bram had moved. He'd stepped off the bottom step into the yard, not toward Crowell exactly, but into the space between them. He was standing in a particular way, weight-even, hands at his sides, that a certain kind of man recognizes as the posture before a decision. Say what you came to say, Bram said. About the land, about the debt, whatever fiction you're selling today. But you don't speak about her again. Crowell looked at him for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes' recalculation. You're going to lose this ranch, Crowell said, and the pleasantness was gone from his voice now. Just the bedrock underneath. Piece by piece if I have to. Cattle, your water, your stores. Whatever it takes until you are so far down you can't see daylight. And then you'll sell to me at my price because it'll be the only offer you get. Or, Bram said, you'll be in front of a judge explaining why 3 ranchers have documented 18 months of interference that all traces back to your hired men. The yard was very quiet. One of Crowell's riders shifted in his saddle. The leather creaked in the cold. Crowell looked at Bram. Then he looked past Bram at Maren. Then he looked to the east, at the fence line that ran along the north pasture's edge, and something in his look changed for just a second. A flicker of something that was not quite confidence. Because at the east fence line there were 2 horses tied that had not been there when he rode in. And the man standing at the fence line looking toward the yard was not one of Bram's hands. Maren had seen him the moment he appeared. She recognized him from Bram's description, Fletcher Ames, who had ridden over that morning without announcement, who Cutter had simply acknowledged and directed to wait at the east line. Beside Ames was a man she didn't know but whose posture, as she looked more carefully, had the specific quality of a man wearing authority that wasn't marked on the outside. Crowell's jaw tightened. Who is that, neighbors? Bram said. The one on the right, Maren said from the porch, her voice clear in the cold air. That's Deputy Marsh from the county seat. He rode in with Mr. Ames this morning. She had not known this was going to happen. She had not arranged it. But she had learned, in 3 months on this ranch, to recognize the shape of something working in her favor when it appeared, and to meet it without hesitation. Crowell looked at his 5 men. Then he looked at Cutter in the barn doorway. At Dex near the grain shed. At Jesse, who had appeared at the corner of the house with his arms crossed and his face neutral. He looked at Ames and the deputy at the fence line. He looked at Bram, who had not moved and was not going to move. And for the first time since Maren had laid eyes on Thaddeus Crowell, she saw something in his face that was not contempt or calculation or performance. She saw a man who had expected a smaller room and had walked into a larger one. "This isn't over," Crowell said. One of his own riders, the one at the far left, a lean man with a sun-worn face who had been still and watchful the entire time, spoke for the first time. Quiet, not to Crowell, just into the air. Maybe it ought to be. Crowell turned and looked at the man. The man looked back at him without expression. The yard was silent. A horse stamped once. The cold moved through. "Walk away," the lean rider said, flat, like he was describing something that had already happened. Crowell said nothing. He stood in Bram Halloway's yard for 3 more seconds. Maren counted them, and then he turned and mounted his horse in a single practiced motion and rode out through the gate. 4 of his men followed. The lean rider, last to go, paused at the gate. He turned in the saddle and looked back at the yard for a moment, and his eyes met Maren's from across the distance. It was not a friendly look, and it was not a hostile one. It was something else that she couldn't name. Then he rode out. The gate stood open. Bram turned and looked up at Maren on the porch. She was looking at where the lean rider had disappeared. "Who is that man?" she said. "I don't know," Bram said. But she would. Before the week was out, she would know his name. And his name would change everything. His name was Ephraim Danner. Bram found this out from Deputy Marsh the following morning, when Marsh rode back through on his way to the county seat and stopped at the house to give Bram a brief account of what the previous day had meant from a legal standpoint. Marsh was a spare man who chose words the way a careful person chooses footing on uncertain ground, one at a time, with attention. He sat at Bram's kitchen table and drank Maren's coffee and said that Crowell's appearance on the property, combined with the documented record of the preceding months, gave the county enough basis to begin a formal investigation. "The arson alone is a serious crime," Marsh said. "Livestock theft compounds it. We're not talking about a land dispute anymore. We're talking about a criminal campaign." "How long does an investigation take?" Bram said. "Depends on what turns up," Marsh said. He looked at his coffee cup, and on whether anyone from Crowell's side decides to talk. Maren, at the stove, said without turning around, the rider who spoke. At the end, before they left, Marsh looked at her back. "Ephraim Danner," she said. "That's who you mean." Marsh was quiet for a moment. "You know him?" "I didn't yesterday," she said. "I know him now." She had asked Cutter the previous evening, who had asked Ames, who had identified the lean rider by name before he rode back to his own property. He's worked for Crowell for about 3 years. Before that, he worked 2 ranches south of here. He has a reputation for being reliable. She turned now and looked at Marsh directly. He also has a reputation for drawing a line somewhere. According to Fletcher Ames, he walked off a job in Wyoming 4 years ago when his employer asked him to do something he wouldn't do. Marsh studied her. What was the something? Ames didn't know the specifics, she said. Just that Danner left, and the employer was not pleased about it. Marsh was quiet. He set his cup down. "A man like that," Maren said, "who has watched what's been done to 3 ranching families over the past year, who rode into this yard yesterday and heard Crowell threaten to dismantle everything, piece by piece, a man like that may have already drawn his line and not yet found the right door to knock on." Marsh looked at Bram. Bram looked at Maren. She went back to the stove. "I'll see what I can find out about Danner," Marsh said. "Don't approach him officially yet," Maren said. "Not in town, not where Crowell's people will see it. If he's going to come forward, he'll need to feel like it's his own decision." Marsh picked up his hat from the table. He looked like a man who had come in expecting to deliver information and was leaving having received considerably more than he gave. He nodded once, to Maren specifically, before he went out. After the door closed, Bram turned and looked at her. "How do you do that?" he said. She didn't pretend not to understand the question. "I pay attention," she said, "and I'd think about what I'd need if I were in a position where I'd seen something wrong and wasn't sure what to do about it." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been in that position." "Yes," she said, "more than once." He nodded slowly and didn't push it further because he understood enough. 3 days passed without incident, which after the previous months felt less like relief and more like the moment before a held breath is released. Maren kept the ledger current and kept her routines unchanged up before 4. Fire in the stove, kitchen running, accounts in order, stores managed. The east wall repair was underway, Bram having contracted 2 carpenters from town who worked through the cold steadily and without drama. The sound of hammering became the sound of the ranch's days for that week, a regular percussion against the winter silence. On the 4th night after Crowell's visit, someone knocked at the kitchen door at 9:30 in the evening. Maren was alone in the kitchen. Bram was in the front room. She heard the knock, not the main door. The kitchen door, the one that opened to the side yard, the one that someone would use if they did not want to be seen approaching the house from the road. She went to the door and opened it. Ephraim Danner stood in the side yard. He had no hat. His coat was the same brown one she'd seen in the yard 3 days before, and he had the particular look of a man who has spent several days deciding something and has arrived at the decision just recently enough that he hasn't had time to look sure about it. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Miss Whitlock," he said. She had not told him her name, that he knew it meant he had done his own paying attention. "Mr. Danner," she said. "Come in." He came in. He looked around the kitchen the way a careful man looks around an unfamiliar room, not suspicious, just taking stock. He was lean in a way that suggested he had always been lean rather than that he had lost weight, and his face was the kind that had been outdoors in every season for many years. Maren put the coffee pot on without asking. She pulled out a chair across the table from where she'd been sitting. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He put his hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. Bram had heard the door. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, and when he saw Danner, he went still for a second, the specific stillness of recognizing someone you last saw on the opposite side of a confrontation. Then he came in and sat at the head of the table without being invited, because it was his table, and he looked at Danner with a face that was careful. "You rode with him 3 days ago," Bram said. "I did," Danner said. "And now you're at my kitchen door at night." "I am." He paused. "I figure you can hear me out, or you can tell me to leave." "I'd rather you heard me out." Bram glanced at Maren. She was pouring coffee, not looking at either of them, which he understood by now meant she was listening to everything. "Talk," Bram said. Danner wrapped his hands around the mug Maren set in front of him. He looked at it for a moment. Then he started. He had been working for Crowell for 3 years. He had started honest. There was genuine ranch work to be done on Crowell's property, and Crowell paid well and on time, which covered a lot of things a man might otherwise look at sideways. He knew Crowell was ambitious. He knew Crowell played hardball on land deals. He told himself that was business, and that he was a horseman and a ranch hand, not Crowell's conscience. The first thing he was asked to do that he didn't like was the fence cutting. That was in the fall, targeting Ames first. He'd told himself it was just fence posts, that nobody got hurt. He'd done it and gone back to his bunk and not slept as well as he used to. Then the water line. He hadn't done that one himself, Rudel Pate had done it, but he'd known it was happening and had said nothing. Then the cattle. He had been part of the crew that moved 32 of Bram's cattle in the night, and he described the operation in detail that was specific enough that Maren's hand tightened around her pen without her realizing it. 3 men, 2 directions to split the tracks. The cattle pushed into the rocky ground north of the creek, and then further east, where they'd been held in a box canyon on a piece of land Crowell held under a different name. "Are they still there?" Bram said, and his voice was very quiet. "Some of them," Danner said. "About 20 head. The others were moved south and sold through a buyer in Billings who doesn't ask questions." Bram looked at the table. "The fire," Maren said. "The storage building." Danner's jaw tightened. "That was Pate. Crowell ordered it, but he gave it to Pate. I found out after." He paused. "I told Crowell I was done after that." "What did he say?" she asked. "He said men who quit on him had a way of having bad luck," Danner said flatly. "I told him I'd consider myself warned." Maren looked at him. "And now you're here." "Now I'm here." He looked at his coffee. "I've watched what this man has done to 3 families in this valley. I've watched it up close, and I've done some of it with my own hands, and I'm not—" He stopped. He seemed to be choosing something with some difficulty. I'm not someone who does things I can't live with. I thought I could live with some of this. Turns out I was wrong about where my line was. Kitchen was quiet. If you're asking whether I'll talk to the sheriff, he said, that's why I came. Maren looked at Bram. Bram looked at Danner. All of it, Bram said. The fence cutting, the cattle, the water line, the fire? All of it, Danner said. And the debt, the $500 your father supposedly owed. Crowell invented it. He has a man in the county records who can make paper look old. Same trick he used on the Beckett property. Bram was very still. He has a contact in the county records office, Maren said slowly. Had, Danner said. The man retired in December, but the false documents he made are still in circulation. The one about your father's debt exists on paper. He looked at Bram. I've seen it. It's good work, looks real. Maren turned to a fresh page in the ledger. I need you to tell me everything about that document. Everything you know about how it was made and where it is. Danner looked at the ledger. For a moment, something in his face shifted something like relief. She thought, though it was complicated relief, the kind that comes from putting something heavy down, without knowing yet whether the floor underneath it will hold. All right, he said. He talked for 2 hours. Maren wrote everything down. She wrote in the organized way. She wrote everything dated, specific, structured, so that each claim was separated from the next and could be examined individually. When Danner described something that could be corroborated by physical evidence, she marked it with a small asterisk. When he described something that was his testimony alone, she noted that too. She did not editorialize. She did not ask leading questions. She asked the kind of questions that a record needed, answered who was present, what time, what words were used, what she would find if she went to a specific location. Bram sat at the end of the table and listened, and only spoke twice, once to ask about the Box Canyon location, and once to ask a question about the Billings buyer that Danner answered carefully and partially, which Maren noted in the margin. When Danner finished, the fire in the stove had burned low, and the kitchen had gotten cold enough that Maren got up and put another piece of wood in, without breaking the silence. You'll need somewhere to stay, she said. Not at Crowell's property. I've already cleared my things out, Danner said. I've got a bedroll. Not in a bedroll in January, she said. She looked at Bram. Bram looked at Danner for a long moment. A man who had cut his fences, who had helped move his cattle in the dark, who was sitting in his kitchen at midnight, telling him where 20 of those cattle might still be found. The bunkhouse has room, Bram said. It sounded like something being decided in real time, which it was. You'll earn your keep, Danner nodded. I can do that. I'm not forgiving what you were part of, Bram said. I want that clear between us. I know, Danner said. I'm not asking for that, but I'm not going to send a man out into January with a bedroll when he's just told me the truth. Danner looked at him for a moment. Something in his face that was not gratitude exactly, something older than gratitude. Thank you, he said. Sheriff Aldous came the next morning. Maren had sent word before dawn through Cutter, who rode to town while it was still dark at her specific request, because she wanted Aldous to have the night's account before anyone else did. Aldous arrived at 9 with Deputy Marsh and sat at the kitchen table across from Danner and listened for 3 hours. He listened the way he read, slowly, thoroughly, attending to each thing before moving to the next. He asked questions that were sharp in a quiet way, the kind of questions that clarify rather than pressure. Danner answered them steadily, and when he wasn't certain of something he said so, which Aldous seemed to appreciate more than false certainty would have earned. At the end, Aldous sat back in his chair and looked at the table for a long time. The Box Canyon, he said. You can take us there. Can take you there, Danner said. The Billings buyer. You don't know his name. I know what he looks like, and I know where the transactions happened, Danner said. There's a livery on the south end of Billings, east side of the main road. 2 of the transactions happened in the back of that livery. Aldous looked at Marsh. Something moved between them. The forged document, Aldous said. He looked at the notes Maren had taken during Danner's account. He had been reading them off and on throughout the morning, and he handled them with the careful respect of someone who recognized quality work. You've seen it. I held it in my hands, Danner said. Crowell showed it to me when he was setting up the debt claim. He liked showing that kind of thing. Liked you to know how well he'd done it. Where is it kept? Aldous said. His office in the main house. Middle drawer of the desk, in a leather folder with other papers. He paused. There are other documents in that folder. Records of the other properties. The Beckett sale. An account in a different name that I think is where the money from the cattle sales goes. Kitchen was very quiet. Mr. Danner, Aldous said carefully, I want to make sure you understand what happens next. You are a material witness to multiple serious crimes. Your testimony will be central to any prosecution. That means Crowell's lawyers will try to make you the story instead of him. They will say you are a disgruntled employee, that you are lying to reduce your own exposure, that everything you've said tonight is self-serving. I know that, Danner said. Your testimony alone isn't enough, Aldous said. But your testimony combined with what's in that folder, and with these records, he touched Maren's ledger, and with the accounts from Ames and Gruder, and with 20 cattle in a box canyon, and with a livery in Billings that begins to be something. Then let's go get it, Danner said. They went to the box canyon 2 days later. Aldous, Marsh, Bram, Danner, and 2 men the county sent up who had the specific function of witnessing and recording what was found. They rode out in a cold gray morning that threatened snow and came back in the early afternoon with 19 cattle won, had not survived the winter conditions, and a detailed record of the canyon's location, its access points, and the evidence of recent occupation by people who had been managing the cattle there. Bram saw his own brand on the cattle's hides in the canyon and said nothing for a long moment. Just looked. Then he looked at Danner, who was looking at the ground, and then he looked at the sky. And whatever he decided in that moment, he kept to himself. On the ride back, Cutter came up alongside Bram and said quietly, 19 is better than none. It is, Bram said. And the other 13, they were sold and they're gone, and that's money lost, but it's not. I know what it is, Bram said. I know what it isn't. Let's get them home. They got them home. The trial was set for the second week of March. In the 6 weeks between Danner's testimony and the trial date, the case that Aldous and the county built was the kind that a good prosecutor calls a structure and a bad defense attorney calls a nightmare. The forged document was found in Crowell's desk exactly where Danner said it would be, in the leather folder, alongside records of 3 other transactions that raised serious questions about how 4 properties in the valley had changed hands over the previous decade. The account in a different name was traced to a bank in Helena and contained a sum that, when placed against the documented cattle losses across multiple ranches, told a clear story to anyone who could do arithmetic. Rudell Pate was found. He was found in a boarding house in Billings, which Marsh had located through the livery connection, and when Marsh sat across from him and explained the weight of an arson conviction against the possibility of cooperation, Pate made the calculation that most people make when they understand that the person who hired them has no particular interest in their welfare. He confirmed the fire. He confirmed who ordered it. He confirmed 2 fence cuttings and the water line. He could not confirm the cattle operation because he had not been part of it, but he confirmed enough else that his testimony, added to Danner's and the physical evidence, left Crowell's defense very little room to work with. Maren knew all of this the way she knew most things in pieces, as they came, through Bram's reports of his conversations with Aldous and Marsh, through what Ames and Gruder passed along when they met, and through her own capacity to assemble pieces into a picture without needing someone to draw it for her. She kept the ledger current throughout. She was not sure the ledger would be needed in court, but she kept it current because keeping it current was the discipline she had built over months, and she was not going to set it aside because the immediate crisis had shifted shape. She was also, during these weeks, living in a changed house. Changed because of what Bram had said in the kitchen after the fire, not said fully, not finished saying, but said enough that it was between them, in a way that could not be unsaid. Changed because they had been through something together that people who merely work in proximity do not go through. Changed because Bram had stopped pretending. He came to the kitchen in the evenings because the fire was better there. He didn't push. She was grateful for that. She was also She admitted to herself on one particular evening, while she was writing in the ledger, and he was sitting across from her reading, and neither of them had spoken in an hour. Aware that his not pushing had a specific quality to it, it was patience, not indifference. There was a difference. She had spent enough time around both kinds of men to know it precisely. One evening in late February, she said to him, without preamble and without looking up from the ledger, "My name was clean before Miles City. 3 years of honest work for 2 different families, solid references, nothing wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. She looked up. "You know? I wrote to a woman in Forsyth," he said. "A Mrs. Alderton. You worked for her husband for 2 years before Baines. She said you were the best she'd seen, and losing you was a loss she hadn't recovered from." Maren stared at him. He looked slightly uncomfortable, which she found oddly human. "I wrote in December," he said, "after the fire. He stopped. I wanted to know what was true. You could have asked me," she said. "I know," he said, "but people say things about themselves that they believe that aren't always the whole picture. And I wanted the picture from outside." He held her eyes. Mrs. Alderton wrote 2 pages. She didn't have a single critical thing to say. Maren looked at the ledger. She was quiet for a moment. Something moved through her, not quite emotion, but adjacent to it. The particular sensation of being accurately known. "That was not your business to do," she said. "No," he agreed. "But thank you," she said, and went back to writing. Trial convened on a Tuesday. The courtroom in the county seat was a plain room with high windows and wooden benches, and a particular smell of pine floor and cold air and old paper. Maren sat in the 3rd row with Bram on one side and Gruder's wife, whose name was Vera, on the other. She had met Vera twice since the beginning of the year, and Vera was the kind of woman whose warmth was uncomplicated, which Maren found more restorative than she'd expected. Crowell sat at the defendant's table with 2 lawyers from Helena who wore suits that had been pressed on a train and looked at the room with the professional neutrality of men who had argued in worse places. The prosecution took 2 days. Obese testified, Marsh testified. The physical evidence was presented: the forged document, the account records, the Box Canyon location, and the recovered cattle with Bram's brand clearly on them. Danner took the stand on the second afternoon and testified for nearly 3 hours, and he did it the way he'd done everything since coming to Bram's kitchen steadily, without decoration, saying what he knew and nothing beyond it. Crowell's lawyers did exactly what Obese had predicted. They tried to make Danner the story. They characterized him as a man seeking to deflect his own criminal exposure, pointed out that he had, by his own admission, participated in fence cutting and cattle theft, and suggested that his account of Crowell's instructions was convenient invention designed to shift blame upward. Danner sat through this without visibly reacting, and when he was asked to respond, he said, "I understand why you're saying that. It would be true if I'd come forward before there was enough other evidence to build a case without me. But by the time I walked into that kitchen, there were 19 cattle in a canyon with Halloway's brand on them, a forged document in Crowell's desk drawer, right where I told you it would be, and a ledger with 4 months of documented evidence that matched everything I described. If I was making things up, I got lucky on every detail." Courtroom was not supposed to react to testimony. It reacted anyway, just slightly, just a shift in the air. Crowell's lawyers called their witnesses. Character witnesses who spoke to Crowell's standing in the business community. Men who described him as a straightforward dealer, a man who drove a hard bargain, but within the bounds of accepted practice. One of them looked uncomfortable on the stand and answered questions about specific property transactions with a precision that suggested he had rehearsed carefully. Then they called Maren. She had known they might. Obese had warned her, and Bram had warned her, and she had spent 3 evenings mentally preparing for it, in the specific way she prepared for everything by thinking through what she knew, what she didn't know, and where the gaps were. She walked to the stand and sat down and looked at the courtroom without looking away from it. She saw Bram in the 3rd row. He was watching her with a steadiness that she drew on without meaning to. Crowell's lead lawyer was a man named Hargrove, and he approached the stand with the particular confidence of someone who has done research. "Miss Whitlock," he said, "you were employed as a cook on the Halloway ranch." "I manage the household and accounts," she said. "I also cook." You arrived at the Halloway Ranch in the fall of last year. Yes. And before that you were employed by a hardware merchant named Culver Baines in Miles City. Yes. And you left that position under circumstances that involved an accusation of financial impropriety. She had expected this. She looked at Hargrove without changing her expression. I left that position when my employer died, and his brother made a false accusation. Yes, false, Hargrove said, your characterization. And the truth, she said. The brother was looking for an explanation for discrepancies in his brother's records that predated my employment by 2 years. I was a convenient explanation. The brother believed otherwise. The brother was wrong, she said. You're welcome to contact Mrs. Alderton of Forsyth, with whom I worked for 2 years before Mr. Baines, or Mr. and Mrs. Carroll of Miles City, for whom I worked before that. I can also provide you the actual account records from the Baines household, which I kept and which show no discrepancy during my employment. The discrepancies in question date to 1,880 and 1,881 before I arrived. Hargrove paused. It was a small pause, the kind that isn't obvious unless you're watching for it. He'd prepared for her to be defensive. She hadn't been defensive. You produced the central documentation in this case, he said, pivoting. Kept records, she said. Yes, records that paint a very convenient picture for your employer. Records that describe what happened, she said, including dates and times and names of witnesses which you are welcome to check against the witnesses' own accounts. I've noticed they tend to match. Someone in the courtroom made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. The judge looked at the room. The room settled. You have a significant personal interest in the outcome of this case, Hargrove said. I have an interest in the truth of it, she said, which is somewhat different. You are emotionally involved with the defendant. He meant Bram, she understood. In a way that goes beyond employment. The courtroom shifted again. Maren looked at Hargrove. Then she looked at the jury, because she understood that's who this question was actually for. I am employed by Bram Halloway, she said clearly. I also respect him considerably. And I can tell you that neither of those things has any effect on what I wrote in that ledger, because I wrote exactly what happened, exactly when it happened, with the names of people who were present. The ledger doesn't know who I respect. It only knows what I observed. Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, no further questions. She walked back to her seat. Bram was looking at her. She sat down beside him and looked at the front of the courtroom, and her hands in her lap were not entirely steady, which she was careful not to show. His hand, on the bench between them, moved the small distance necessary to cover hers. She didn't move away. Vera Gruder, on her other side, said nothing and looked at the front of the courtroom with a small, private expression. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They came back with a conviction on livestock theft, destruction of property, and arson. The fraud charges related to the forged document were separated into a secondary proceeding that would be heard in 2 weeks. Courtroom did not erupt. It absorbed. People looked at each other, and at Crowell, and at the floor. Crowell sat at his table, and his face did nothing readable for a long moment. Then something went out of it, not dramatically, just quietly, like a lamp turned down. Outside, on the courthouse steps, in the cold March air, the world was exactly as it had been 2 hours before. The same street, the same buildings, the same flat Montana light. Bram stood beside Maren on the steps, and she could feel that he was processing something large and private. Ames was there, and Gruder, and Vera, and the particular quiet of people who have been through something together and are not yet sure what to do with the other side of it. After a moment, Ames said, "Drinks at the hotel?" Gruder said yes. They started down the steps. Bram didn't move immediately, and so Maren didn't either. They stood on the courthouse steps together in the cold and looked at the street. 4 months ago, you walked through my gate with your shoes worn through, Bram said. I know, she said. He looked at her. He looked like a man who had something prepared and had decided the prepared version was wrong. I don't know how to do this, he said. Say it the right way. I've been thinking about it for 2 months, and I still don't have it right. Then say it the wrong way, she said. He looked at the street, then at her. I don't want to be alone in that house anymore. and I don't want you to be anywhere else." He paused. "That's probably not enough." "It's enough," she said. "I love you," he said. "I should have said that first." She held his eyes. The cold air moved between them, and the street went on doing what streets do, and 4 months of hard things were behind them, and ahead was something that hadn't been named yet. "I know," she said. "I love you too." She looked at him steadily. "Now let's go have a drink with the neighbors. You can say the rest of it properly at home." Something in his face that had been tight for a very long time let go. They went down the steps. The drink at the hotel was 2 drinks, and then 3, and somewhere in the middle of the third round Gruder made a toast that was not particularly eloquent, but was entirely sincere. And Ames laughed at something Bram said in a way that suggested months of tension, leaving a body all at once. And Vera Gruder put her hand over Maren's on the table and said simply, "You did that." And Maren said, "We did that." And Vera shook her head with a small smile that said she knew the difference. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, Bram and Maren, the horses moving at an easy pace on the road they'd traveled many times now in both directions, and in most kinds of weather. The light was doing the thing it does in Montana in March, coming in low and sideways, and turning the brown hills a color that wasn't quite gold but was trying. Neither of them talked much. There was too much to say, and not enough urgency to say it, which was its own kind of relief after months of everything being urgent. When they came through the gate, Cutter was in the yard. He looked at their faces and read them the way a man reads weather, and he nodded once and said, "Good," and went back to what he was doing. That was all anyone needed to say about it for the moment. The secondary fraud proceedings came 2 weeks later, and they went the way the first trial had gone, not easily, not without the grinding procedural labor of evidence and counter-argument, but in the same direction. The forged document was examined by 2 men from the county who knew old paper and old ink, and testified that the document was neither as old as it claimed nor produced by the same hand as the legitimate records from that period. The account in the false name was traced fully. The man who had worked in the county records office and produced the forgery was located in his retirement in a town 2 counties east, and when Marsh sat across from him and explained his situation, the man's retirement plans adjusted considerably. Crowell was convicted on the fraud charges. The sentencing came in April. He received 4 years on the combined charges, to be served at the territorial facility in Deer Lodge. His Helena lawyers argued for reduced sentencing based on his standing and his economic contributions to the valley. The judge listened to this argument with the patience of a man who had heard many variations of it and found Crowell's version unpersuasive. Bram was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. He had said, when Aldous informed him of the date, that he had fence posts to set on the north line, and he intended to set them. Maren was there, in the back row, because she felt that someone who had spent 6 months building the case should be present when it concluded. She sat beside Vera Gruder and watched Thaddeus Crowell hear his sentence with the face of a man who has spent a long time being certain about the world and has just discovered that certainty was poorly placed. He didn't look at her when he was let out. She hadn't expected him to. But she watched him go, and she felt something settle in her chest that was not triumph. Exactly, triumph felt too bright and clean for what it actually was. It was more like the feeling of a long debt finally balanced. Something owed to herself for 6 years of being judged wrong by powerful men who assumed they knew her story better than she did. She rode home under a sky that was moving toward spring in the slow, provisional way of northern springs, and she thought about what it meant to be at the end of something. Bram had gotten the fence posts set. He came in from the north line at dusk with mud on his boots and a cut on his right forearm from a wire that had snapped and caught him. And he sat at the kitchen table while Maren looked at the cut with the practical eye she'd developed for ranch injuries. "It's not bad," he said. "I'll decide that," she said, and cleaned it and wrapped it with the same methodical care he'd used on her burned hand in January, which neither of them mentioned, but which they were both aware of, in the way couples become aware of the small symmetries that accumulate in a life shared. They were not yet married. That was still ahead, though not far ahead, and it had been discussed in the plain-spoken way. They discussed most things not romantically, not with ceremony, just as the next fact of what their life was going to be. Bram had asked her properly, which he'd done on the evening they got back from the first trial, sitting in the kitchen after supper, when the house was quiet and the fire was low, and he'd said it in the wrong order again. Which she'd told him later was actually the right order for him specifically, because it was true rather than arranged. She'd said yes. She'd said it without hesitation and without qualification and without the particular guarded calculation that she'd spent 6 years applying to every decision about where she was and whether she was safe there. She just said yes and meant it in all the directions it pointed. They set the date for late May, when the worst of the mud season would be past, and the ranch would be entering the long working stretch of summer that required everyone's full attention. There was nothing elaborate about the planning. There was a great deal of practical coordination, because a wedding on a working ranch in 1888 was fundamentally a logistical operation, and Maren approached it the same way she approached everything, with a list, a sequence, and the willingness to adapt when something didn't go according to the list. The dress was a problem, not because she couldn't find something suitable in town, but because the suitable things in town were built for a different kind of woman than she was. And the alterations required were significant enough that the seamstress in town looked at her with an expression that Maren had seen before on certain faces and had learned to simply look through. She paid for the alterations, chose a fabric that was practical and still good, and did not spend any portion of her limited emotional energy on what the seamstress thought. Vera Gruder came with her for the fitting and said afterward, over coffee at the hotel, "You know she was completely wrong about that color." "It's perfect on you, I know," Maren said. "I chose it." Vera laughed, a real laugh, and Maren found herself laughing too. And it occurred to her that this was something else she'd been without. For a long time, a woman friend who simply enjoyed her company without reservation or agenda. Spring came the way it always came in Montana, arriving before it was ready, and then spending several weeks becoming itself. The mud season was as bad as anyone had predicted, and the east wall of the rebuilt storage building, which had been finished in February, was tested by a late storm in April that brought wet, heavy snow, and then freezing temperatures and then rain, in the particular cruel sequence that winter produces when it decides to make a final argument. The wall held. The carpenter work was good. Ephraim Danner was still at the ranch. This was not the plan, or rather, there had been no formal plan, just a bunk in January and honest work offered in exchange. But Danner had turned out to be what his reputation said he was: reliable, capable, attentive to detail in the way that distinguished a good ranch hand from a merely adequate one. He and Cutter had developed a working relationship that had no warmth in it, but had considerable mutual respect, which on a working ranch amounted to the same thing. He and Jesse had arrived at some unspoken accommodation that Maren suspected involved a conversation she had not been present for and would never be told about. He did not talk about his time with Crowell. He worked. He was careful with the horses. He fixed things that needed fixing without being asked. He showed up on time for every meal and ate without complaint and said, "Thank you," which was not universal among the ranch hands and which Maren noticed. One morning in early April, she found him in the yard before sunrise, doing a repair on the fence, section nearest the house, not a section that had been damaged, but one that she'd noticed had a post going soft at the base. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone. She'd been intending to add it to the repair list. "How did you know about that post?" she said. "Saw it last week," he said. "Been meaning to get to it." She looked at the post and then at him. "Planning to stay." He kept working. "If that's all right." "It's more than all right," she said. "I just wanted to know if you'd decided." He looked up at her. There was something in his face that was not easy to categorize. A man who had spent a year doing things he shouldn't have, and had spent the following months paying the specific tax that honest men pay when they've been dishonest and know it. Not self-pity. Something more like determination. "I need somewhere that's worth staying for," he said. "Turns out this is it." She nodded. "Then stay," she said, and went back inside to start breakfast. Bram took the cook wanted sign down on a Tuesday in early May, 2 weeks before the wedding. He'd gone out to the gate in the morning for some other purpose and had come back an hour later carrying the plank. He brought it into the kitchen and set it on the table in front of Maren without explanation. She looked at it. The weathered wood, The crooked lettering she'd read from the road 7 months ago. Keeping it? She said. No, he said. I thought about it. Decided I don't need to keep it. I know what it means. He paused. I thought maybe you'd want to. She looked at it for a long moment. The sign that had been her entrance to everything that came after. The wrong address for the right place. The first decent offer she'd had in a very long time, stated in 4 plain words and a practical incentive. No, she said. I know what it means too. He took it out back and added it to the woodpile. She heard the sound of it being split. Then the sound of the kitchen was just the kitchen again, the fire, the morning, what needed to be done next. He came back in and poured himself coffee and sat at the table. Want to put something else up, he said. She looked at him. He had a piece of plank he'd gotten from somewhere, and he set it on the table. It was roughly the same size as the old sign, the wood cleaner, not weathered. He'd been working on it. She could see the lettering was still rough, done with the same hand that had done the original, meaning not a craftsman's hand, but a sincere one. Home found here. She looked at it for a long time. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had spent years in situations that would have broken more fragile people, and she had developed the particular durability that comes from having no other option, and it sat in her like a structural element now, something you could lean on. But the sign on the table and the man across from her and the morning light coming through the kitchen window and the smell of coffee and the sound of the ranch coming awake outside, all of it together did. Something to her that she didn't have the reflex to stop. Pressed her lips together. It's a little corny, she said, and her voice was not entirely even. I know, he said. Put it up anyway, she said. He put it up that afternoon. Cutter came by while he was nailing it to the post and looked at it for a moment and said nothing, which from Cutter was the same as a speech. They married on the 23rd of May. The weather held barely, provisionally, in the way of late May weather in Montana, which cooperates under protest. The morning had been overcast and the afternoon came in clear, and the evening was cool enough that the fire in the yard felt like the right decision rather than an indulgence. It was a working ranch wedding, which meant it was practical and somewhat chaotic and entirely real. Maren's dress fit correctly, not perfectly, and she had done her hair herself in the small oval mirror that had been the only thing she brought to the room off the kitchen 7 months ago. She was not a woman who examined herself in mirrors with anxiety. She examined herself. With the same practical eye, she turned on everything, assessed what was there, and proceeded. What was there was a woman of 31 who looked like herself. Full-figured, dark auburn hair with a few threads in it now that hadn't been there last fall, gray eyes that had spent the winter being very attentive to a great many things. Not conventionally beautiful by the standards of women's magazines or the imagination of men who had not had to work hard, but present, entirely, completely present. She thought about the woman who had walked up that road with worn shoes and a cloth bundle and the specific desperation of someone who has run out of easier options. She thought about what that woman had believed about herself in the moments before she knocked at a stranger's gate that she was used up, that the world had already decided what she was worth, that the best she could hope for was a room and wages and not to be humiliated. She had been wrong about that, and being wrong about it had been the most valuable thing that had ever happened to her. The ceremony was short and plain, and witnessed by everyone on the ranch, plus the Gruters and Fletcher Ames and his wife, and 3 other neighbors who had made the ride. Aldous came. Even Marsh came, though he stood at the edge of the gathering with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who is not entirely comfortable with celebrations. Ephraim Danner stood at the back near the fence with Cutter and was quiet through all of it, which was how he was quiet with attention rather than absence. Bram said his part in the way he said most things directly, without flourish, meaning every word specifically rather than in the general direction of meaning. He was not a poet, but he was precise, and in her experience precision was considerably rarer and more valuable than poetry. When it was done and they were standing in the yard with the evening coming down around the fire and the sound of people talking and the smell of the food Maren had arranged, because even on her own wedding day she had arranged the food, because it was what she was good at and she was not going to apologize for being good at things, Vera Gruder came and stood beside her. How does it feel? Vera said. Maren looked at the yard. At Bram talking to Ames with a glass in his hand. At Jesse Crane doing something near the food table that she suspected would result in something missing. At Cutter and Danner standing together in companionable silence. The rebuilt east wall of the storage building, visible from here, solid and squared and functional. Like something that's been earned, she said. Vera put her arm through hers. That's the right answer, she said. Summer came, and the ranch went back to what ranches do in summer, the relentless productive work of the long days. Cattle drives, and the fence maintenance, and the hay season that required everyone, including people who didn't usually work the fields. Maren worked alongside all of it, not because she had to prove something anymore, but because this was her ranch now, and the distinction between the kitchen and the yard and the accounts and the supply runs had never been clear to her anyway. She took over the accounts fully and formally in June, by agreement with Bram and with the full knowledge of everyone on the ranch. This was not a surprise to anyone. It was merely the formalization of what had been true since approximately November. She found 2 more overcharges from Hewitt's supply not deliberate, as it turned out, just carelessness, and renegotiated the terms again, more thoroughly this time, with the documentation to back her numbers. Hewitt, to his credit, was embarrassed and corrected both. She found a better arrangement for the grain supply through a contact Ames had, which reduced the cost by nearly a fifth. She drafted the winter food preservation plan 3 weeks earlier than it had ever been drafted on this ranch, which meant 3 weeks more preparation time and considerably less waste. Bram watched all of this happen around him and made no comment except to occasionally come into whatever room she was working in and sit down and be present, which she had come to understand was his particular form of saying several things at once. One evening in July, he came in from a long day on the North Line and found her at the table with the accounts spread around her, and a look on her face that he'd learned meant she was steps ahead of wherever the current problem seemed to be. He sat across from her. "What?" he said. "The South approach," she said. "With Crowell's property in receivership, the county is going to sell it." He went still. If someone with money and patience wanted to consolidate the North Grazing Corridor, she said, they'd be positioned to do exactly what Crowell was attempting to do, except legally. "Someone," he said. "Fletcher Ames has resources he's not using," she said. "Gruder has a brother-in-law who has been looking for a land investment for 2 years. And we have the position in the valley." She spread her hands on the table. "If 3 ranching families purchase that property jointly, they control access to the corridor. No single buyer can use it as leverage against any one of them." Bram looked at her. Then he looked at the accounts spread across the table, the numbers she'd been rearranging for weeks, the possibilities she'd been turning over. "You've been thinking about this since the trial," he said. "Since January," she said. "I needed the trial to go the right way first." He looked at the ceiling for a moment in the arithmetic way. "Then, we'd need to move quickly once the property goes to sale." "I know," she said. "I've already drafted a letter to Ames. I need you to read it before I send it." He put out his hand. She gave him the letter. He read it. It was, as everything she wrote was, clear and specific and organized around what actually needed to happen, rather than around what sounded impressive. He read it twice. "One change," he said. "What third paragraph?" "You wrote the Halloway Ranch. It should say Halloway." She looked at him. "Just Halloway," he said. "It's yours, too." The letter back. Made the change. Folded it. "Send it tomorrow," he said. She sent it. Ames responded within a week. Gruder took 2 weeks because Gruder always took 2 weeks. But he responded. The joint proposal for the Crowell property was filed with the county before the sale was publicly announced, and by the time other buyers had learned the property was available. There was already a serious offer on the table from a consortium of 3 established Valley ranchers with clean records and current references. The property sold to them in September. The moment it transferred, the dynamic of the North Valley changed in the specific quiet way that structural changes happen not with drama, not with announcement, just with the simple fact of a new arrangement that made the old threat impossible. No one ranching family controlled the corridor. All 3 did. And all 3 had spent the past year learning what it meant to stand together rather than be picked apart separately. That fall, Bram and Maren rode the north property line together on a clear October morning that was cold enough to see your breath, but not cold enough to be unpleasant. They rode because there were fence lines to check, which was always true, and because Bram liked to look at his land from horseback in October when the light was right and the season had turned. She'd come to understand this about him, that was a man who needed, occasionally, to see the whole of what he was responsible for and confirm it was still there. She had come to share it, not because she'd adopted his habits, but because somewhere in the past year this land had become hers too. Not legally, but in the way that matters more than legality, in the specific attachment of having worked it and worried over it and defended it and built on it, and knowing it in the particular way you know something you have fought for. They stopped at the top of the ridge that ran along the northeast corner and looked south across the valley. The Halloway land spread out below them, the rebuilt storage building, visible from here, the house, the barn, the corrals, the east fence line where Danner was visible as a small figure doing something steady and unhurried. 12,000 acres, Bram said, not to her specifically, just the way people say, the facts they sometimes need to hear out loud. 12,000 acres, she said. He looked at her. She looked at the valley. There was something she had been thinking about for weeks that she hadn't said yet, and she was not someone who left things unsaid once she'd decided they needed saying. I've been thinking about what would have happened if your sign had been straight, she said. He waited. If it had been a straight, clean, well-made sign, I might have walked past it, she said. It looked like something a man had put up in 5 minutes, because he was frustrated and practical and not trying to impress anyone. That's what made me stop. She paused. Was tired of places that were trying to impress people. He thought about this for a moment. Glad it was crooked then. I'm glad it was crooked, she said. And then, because this was the thing she'd actually been thinking about, I spent 6 years believing that what happened in Miles City meant something about me, about what I deserved, that I was the kind of person things went wrong for, and the best I could do was minimize the damage. She was looking at the valley. I was wrong about that, but I couldn't have known I was wrong until I had evidence. This is the evidence, he said. This is some of it, she said. The rest of it is harder to point at. She was quiet for a moment. I think the thing I was most wrong about was that I thought being seen clearly meant being seen kindly. That if someone really looked at me at all of me, the size of me and the history of me and the accusations and the worn shoes and everything, they would see something insufficient. She paused. You looked at all of it, and you didn't see something insufficient. No, he said. That's not nothing, she said. For some people that never happens once. He looked at her for a long moment, with the October light between them and the valley below, and the cold working around the edges of everything. You saved this ranch, she said. We saved it, she said. You specifically, he said. Me and the men, we would have ridden over there angry and given Crowell exactly what he needed. You were the one who understood that building something true was stronger than responding to a lie with force. She shook her head slightly. I understood it because I'd been on the wrong end of it. Powerful men deciding what was true and everyone accepting their version. The only thing that worked against that was documentation. Evidence. Witnesses. She looked at the valley. It's not a special talent. It's what you do when you understand that you can't win by being louder. He was quiet for a moment. Some people go through what you went through and learn to be smaller. To need less. To some do, she said. Was tempted. What stopped you? She thought about it honestly. Stubbornness mostly, she said, and the fact that I'm good at things. It's hard to convince yourself you're insufficient when you know your bread never falls and your accounts never have errors. A small pause. It sounds like vanity. It sounds like self-knowledge, he said. Those aren't the same thing. She looked at him. This was what she meant, this specific quality of his attention, the way he listened to what she actually said rather than to what he expected her to say. She had not known, before him, how rare that was. She thought she knew, but the knowing had been abstract. Now it was concrete, and the concreteness of it was one of the better things in her life. We should check the northeast corner, she said. We should, he agreed. Neither of them moved immediately. Bram, she said. I'm glad I walked up that road. He looked at her. Something in his face that was simple and complete. So am I, he said. Every single day. They rode the northeast corner. The fence was sound. The posts Danner had replaced in the spring were holding well. The land was in better shape than it had been when she arrived, and she knew the specific contributions that had made it so. And the knowledge was satisfying in the way that only earned things are satisfying, not the flush of luck or gift, the solid particular weight of work that held. By the time the first snow came again, the real snow, the kind that stayed the ranch was ready for it in a way it had not been the previous year. The stores were fully stocked. The water lines had been upgraded over the summer, with better materials and proper insulation at the joints. The herd was in good condition going into winter. The accounts were clean and current, and showed a property that was not just surviving but had begun, quietly and without drama, to turn a better corner than it had in several years. Ephraim Danner was one of Bram's most reliable men by the time October was done. He had never become easy company. He was not built for easy, but he was present and honest. And his presence on the ranch had a specific quality that the other men had accepted with the practical pragmatism of people who care more about weather. Someone does the work than about the road they took to get there. He was at the ranch for the first snows. He looked at it coming down from the barn doorway, and he looked like a man who had decided something about where he was that had nothing temporary in it. Jesse Crane had stopped making comments about things that weren't his business sometime around February, which everyone had appreciated without mentioning. He was a better version of himself than he'd been in the fall, in the way that some young men become better versions of themselves when they encounter someone who doesn't respond to their nonsense with either punishment or accommodation, just the steady continuation of someone doing good work and not explaining why. On the first day of real snow, Maren made a large batch of the working soup she'd started keeping on the back of the stove the previous winter. And it sat there through the short afternoon and the long dark evening, and the men came and went and ate and went back to what they were doing. And the kitchen was warm, and the fire was good, and the house was not empty. This was not the life Maren Whitlock had imagined for herself in any of the years before this one. She had imagined in various periods of her life safety, stability, a place where her work was valued and her presence not contingent on factors she couldn't control. She had not imagined this specific kitchen, this specific man, or the particular texture of a morning in Montana when the light came through the east window and the ranch came alive around her and everything that needed to be done was knowable and hers to do. She had not imagined being loved clearly and completely, and without condition by someone who had looked at all of her and chosen all of her, not despite anything, not in spite of anything, just her. The thing about arriving somewhere you didn't know you were looking for is that you can't recognize it until you're already there. She had walked up a dirt road with worn shoes and the specific desperation of someone with diminishing options, and she had found not rescue, because she hadn't needed rescuing. She'd needed fair ground. She had found fair ground, and she had done what she always did on fair ground. She had done her work, and her work had been enough. It had always been enough. She had just needed a place where that was allowed to be true. Outside, the snow came down on 12,000 acres of land that was hers as much as anyone's. The new sign at the gate was white with it, the letters still readable under the accumulation. Home found here. She had thought it was a little corny when he first showed her. She had been right about that. She had also been right to tell him to put it up anyway.